Welcome back to Mr. Bellicho. Before we enter the darkness, I need you to engage. Comment below. Where are you watching from? What time is it in your world right now? Tonight, we're going deep into Albasha Forest in America. The place where park rangers disappear into their own silence, where the trees know secrets that would shatter your mind. These men and women face what hunts in the dark, what watches, what waits. Subscribe, like, share the truth. Tell me your location. Tell me your time. Then, listen closely. The ranger station at Mirror Lake sits 7,200 feet above sea level, and there's a reason nobody wants to work there during winter. I found that out the hard way when they offered me the position 6 months ago. The pay was decent. The isolation was sold as a feature: peace, solitude, connection to nature. Nobody mentioned what happens when the snow falls so thick you can't see 20 feet in front of your own cabin. My name is Akeshita. That's what's on my badge anyway. My great-grandmother gave me that name before she died. She was from the northern Cheyenne, and she always said some names carry weight, protection. Looking back, I think she was warning me about something she couldn't quite articulate. I arrived at Mirror Lake Station on September 1st. The summer crew was leaving. Tom, the ranger who'd been running the station for 3 seasons, gave me a tour like he was showing me a museum nobody visits. His hands shook when he locked up the storage shed. That's what I should have paid attention to. Not the tour, the way his hands shook. The perimeter maintenance is pretty straightforward, he said, pointing to a map covered in red circles and yellow marks. You'll do monthly checks on the northern ridge, check for downed trees, look for illegal camps. The southern approach gets traffic from the main park route, so that's usually clean. I nodded, already thinking about how I'd map out my schedule. Solo work appealed to me then. After 4 years of shared ranger stations and rotating crews, the idea of being alone in nature seemed like exactly what I needed. The winter access gets cut off around November, Tom continued. Once the passes close, you're basically sealed in. Supplies fly in every 2 weeks if the weather permits. If it doesn't, he trailed off, looking out the window at the pines surrounding the station. You make do. How bad does it get? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He walked to the window and pressed his palm against the glass. The previous ranger's log is in the office. Read it. Really read it. Not the official stuff. The notes in the margins. The real observations. That should have been another warning. I was too new to the station to understand why. Tom left on September 3rd. By September 5th, I was alone at Mirror Lake. The first week was perfect. The weather held clear and cool. The aspens were starting to turn gold. The days were manageable. Patrol the perimeter, check the equipment, maintain the station. The nights were quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. I found the logbook on September 6th. It was in the bottom drawer of the desk in the office, behind some old incident reports. The official pages were filled with standard ranger entries, equipment maintenance, weather observations, visitor counts. But Tom was right. The margins were where the real information lived. The notes started 7 years back, from a ranger named Marcus Webb. His entries were clinical at first, just observations about wildlife patterns. But around March of his 3rd year, the tone changed. Sounds in the northern tree line at 0300, not wildlife. Sounded almost like speaking, can't be sure. We'll investigate at dawn. 3 days later, found tracks near Ravens Point. Canine? Too large. Spaced too far apart. Something else. Something big. I read deeper. The entries got more frequent, more urgent. Marcus had become obsessed with whatever was in the mountains with him. He documented every sound, every track, every unusual sighting. Then, in January of year 4, his entries stopped entirely. The next ranger to work the station was someone named Paula. Her first entry said simply, "Marcus is gone. Station is mine now." Paula's tenure was short. She lasted 8 months. Her final entry was handwritten, almost illegible with stress. I heard it again tonight. It came to the edge of the property. It called. I can't describe the sound. It made me want to. I don't want to write this, but it made me want to walk toward it. Something about the pitch, the frequency. It was in my head. I'm leaving. I'm telling them it's a family emergency, but I can't stay. Some things don't belong on this mountain. Some things should stay hidden. The other rangers' entries were similar. Short tenure, increasing unease, strange sounds, tracks that didn't match any catalog. and underneath it all, a growing sense that something was watching them. Tom's entries spanned 3 years. They started professional, they ended fragmented. Something moved through the northern sector. Nothing I've ever seen. The snow tells the story. It came down the ridge, moved parallel to the boundary, then circled back. Why would it circle? Is it curious? Is it hunting? The elk population has changed. They're moving away from the northern sector entirely. Every herd has abandoned that territory. Animals know. They know something we don't. The audio in the storage shed malfunctioned. But I remember setting it. I remember checking the files. There were sounds on that recorder that I didn't know how to categorize. Some were animal, some weren't. Someone who knew what they were looking for could probably match them to something in a database. I destroyed the recordings. I don't want anyone to find what's up there. Not because I'm scared, but because I think it's hungry, and attention is what it's been waiting for. The final entry. I'm leaving. Tell Akeshita, the new ranger, when he arrives. Tell him that the mountain is not empty in winter. It's crowded with things that haven't learned to be seen yet. The trick is not seeing them. The trick is not listening. And the trick is, above all else, not letting them know you've heard them. I should have left that night. I should have called for immediate evacuation. Instead, I sat in that office chair until 2 a.m., reading and rereading Tom's final words. The rational part of my brain found explanations. Mountain lions could make sounds that seemed almost human. The isolation could create paranoia. Bad weather and power outages could explain why some rangers left early. There was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. The other part of my brain, the part my great-grandmother had named, knew something different. I stayed. September turned into October without incident. The weather held remarkably clear. I fell into a routine. Morning patrol of the eastern ridge, afternoon maintenance around the station, evening inventory of supplies and equipment. The work was simple and repetitive, which suited me. After years of constant social noise, the silence of Mirror Lake felt like coming home. I began to understand why some people stayed in these positions despite the isolation. There's a clarity that comes with solitude. The world narrows. Your concerns narrow. What matters is immediate. The work in front of you, the weather, the basic requirements of survival. But I also began to notice things. The first oddity was the ravens. By mid-October, there were fewer of them. The mountain had been alive with their calls in September. They're smart birds. They follow rangers on patrol looking for scraps. I was used to their presence, but in October they avoided the northern sector entirely. I'd see them congregate on the opposite ridge, almost as if pushed away. The second oddity was the quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of solitude. A different kind of quiet. A listening quiet. Nights at the station became something I wanted to move through, not enjoy. I'd catch myself holding my breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. I was alone on October 18th when I first heard the sound. I was in the equipment shed cataloging the winter supplies. It was late afternoon, maybe 4 p.m. The sun was already dropping behind the peaks, and the temperature had started to fall. I was focused on inventory numbers when I heard it. It wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. It was distant, coming from somewhere in the northern tree line, and it was almost like music, almost like someone singing. The pitch was too high to be human, but the structure, there was deliberateness to it. This wasn't animal noise. This was something trying to produce melody. I stopped moving. I literally stopped, clipboard in hand, and listened. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then it stopped. The silence that followed felt like the mountain exhaling. I didn't feel afraid exactly. I felt noticed, like I'd been seen by something I'd been trying to ignore. I finished the inventory without leaving the shed. Over the next week, I heard the sound 5 more times. Always from the northern tree line. Always at dusk. Always the same structure. A series of notes that seemed almost like they were spelling something in a language I didn't know. My rational mind said it could be wind through rocks. Could be some animal vocalization I wasn't familiar with. Could be anything but what it sounded like. My blood said it was something calling. October 27th, I decided to investigate. I know that sounds stupid in retrospect. Looking back through the logbooks, I can see the pattern. Every ranger who investigated the sounds was gone or leaving within weeks. But at the time, it felt necessary. I was a ranger. It was my job to patrol the territory and account for unusual activity. I couldn't do my job effectively if I was afraid of the northern sector. I told myself I was being rational. I packed a day pack with water, flashlight, signal flares, and my radio. I left a note at the station, a stupid gesture since I was the only one there, but it felt important to mark the moment. I set out at 7 a.m., before the sun was fully up. The Northern Ridge access was a 4-mile hike through dense pine and aspen. The terrain wasn't difficult, but it was old-growth forest, thick with fallen logs and overgrown trail markers. As I climbed, I noticed the animal sign was indeed sparse. No fresh elk tracks, no deer scat, no bird nests. The forest seemed deliberately empty. About 2 miles in, I found the first track. It was on a game trail running parallel to the ridge. I almost walked past it, but something made me stop and turn back. The print was in soft earth beside a creek, clear and deep. I knelt down to examine it. It was wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. It had 5 toes, like a bear or canine, but the spacing was off. The depth suggested enormous weight concentrated on specific points, and there were claw marks, but not from paw strikes. These were from the creature standing still, pressing its claws into the earth as if gripping it. The track was fresh. From the morning, maybe even from last night. I photographed it and continued. More alert now. My hand drifted toward the flare gun on my belt. At mile 3, I found the bone. It was an elk femur, at least 3 feet long. But it wasn't bleached and old. It still had tissue clinging to the break point, dried but not mummified. And the break wasn't clean. It wasn't a break from impact or predation. It looked like someone had deliberately twisted the bone until it snapped. The ligaments were torn in ways that suggested malicious intent. This wasn't predation. This was something else. This was something playing. I didn't realize I'd backed away until I nearly tripped over a fallen log. My heart was doing something weird. Not the pounding fear of sudden danger, but a slow, deliberate acceleration. Like it was waking up to something. I checked my radio. No signal. That wasn't unusual. The terrain was rough and the station's range was limited, but I suddenly understood why Tom's final note had emphasized not being seen. I turned back toward the station, not running but moving fast, deliberately fast. That's when I heard the sound again. It came from ahead of me, from the direction of the station. It was the same melody I'd been hearing at dusk, but now it was different, faster, more agitated, and there was something underneath it, a bass note, that I felt more than heard. It vibrated in my chest, made my teeth ache. I stopped moving. I don't remember making the conscious decision. My body just stopped. The sound came again, and with it came a realization that made every nerve in my body fire simultaneously. It wasn't calling from the northern tree line. It was behind me. I turned slowly. The forest behind me was dense and dark, the afternoon light barely penetrating the canopy. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something. That noticing sensation I'd felt before. It was stronger now. It was right. The sound came a third time, and this time it changed. It became something like words, not English words, but something ancient and hungry, articulated through a mouth that wasn't designed for human speech. I ran. I've run from bears before, ones I'd stumbled across in the wild. That's a specific kind of fear, sudden, primal, focused. This was different. This was being hunted by something that wanted me alive. And the knowing of that fact was worse than any immediate danger. The forest turned into a blur. I don't remember the descent clearly. I remember branches hitting my face. I remember my pack getting caught on something and me just shrugging it off mid-stride. I remember the song following me. It wasn't getting closer, but it wasn't getting farther away either. It was pacing me. When I burst out onto the access road that led to the station, I was hyperventilating. My lungs hurt. My vision was swimming. But I could see the station clearing ahead, and I just ran toward it. I made it to the cabin, got the door locked, and stood in the kitchen breathing like I'd run a marathon. My hands were shaking. I kept turning to look out the windows, expecting to see something pressed against the glass, but there was nothing. Just empty forest and lengthening afternoon shadows. The sound stopped. I sat in that kitchen for 4 hours, waiting for dark. When it finally came, I turned on every light in the station. I gathered supplies and moved to the main room, and I waited for something I couldn't name to arrive at my door. It never came, but I heard it in the distance, at the edges of the property. Calling. I didn't leave. That's the thing I can't explain to normal people, and I've tried. Why didn't I call for evacuation? Why didn't I request immediate removal? The answer is complicated, and it still doesn't make sense to me. Part of it was pride. I didn't want to become another ranger who'd failed at the position, couldn't handle the isolation, Part of it was not knowing how to explain what had happened. I had no proof, no video. A story about a sound and a bad feeling doesn't get you extracted from a mountain station. But the real reason was something else. Something I didn't want to admit. I wanted to understand. In the days after the incident, I pulled Tom's logbook apart, page by page, and tried to find the pattern. The previous rangers had documented 17 distinct sounds over multiple years. 17 different vocalizations. Tom believed they were trying to communicate. He'd even started to catalog them, assigning letter designations like they were a language. There was the singing sound, which he called A. There was a deep, grinding noise he called B, a clicking pattern he called C, a high-pitched wail labeled D, and so on. Each sound had appeared multiple times across different seasons. Each sound had been documented by multiple rangers. Tom had started noting the times and locations where sounds appeared. The pattern that emerged was unsettling. The sounds came more frequently in cold months. They came from specific locations, always the northern sector, but with a clear circuit. The creature, because I'd stopped pretending it might be natural geology or wind patterns, seemed to follow a route, a loop around the property. Tom's notes indicated it had been doing this for at least 7 years. Same circuit, same approximate times, same locations. The creature was mapping the territory. I spent the last week of October becoming obsessed with understanding the routine. I set up motion sensors around the perimeter, old equipment I'd requisitioned from storage. I placed them at the points Tom had marked as high activity zones, and then I waited. The sensors activated on October 31st. The first alert came at 2:17 a.m., sensor 8, northern boundary. Nothing visible on the camera, it was too dark, and the camera had limited range. But the sensor had been triggered. Something had crossed that point. Over the next hour, sensors activated in a sequence. 8, 7, 6, 5, then the eastern stations, 2, 1, then silence until 4:47 a.m., when the southern sensors lit up, 9, 10, 11. I watched the pattern on my monitor, timing the intervals. The creature was moving through a circuit around the station, a full perimeter check, and it was moving at human walking speed. Not faster, just deliberate. At 5:34 a.m. it reached a point directly north of the station, sensor 4, which was mounted on a tree just outside the property line. The creature stopped. The sensor registered continuous motion, not passage. It was standing still. For 11 minutes, the sensor was triggered continuously. Then, at 5:45 a.m., the creature moved on, south along the western edge, then around the back of the property. And at 6:18 a.m., it moved back into the northern forest. The circuit was complete. It had taken just under 4 hours. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the main room watching the sensor readouts and tried to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't random behavior. This was routine. This was a creature that had learned a pattern and was maintaining it, which meant it was intelligent, which meant it was choosing to come here, which meant it knew I was here. November brought snow and the ceiling of the winter passes. Supplies still flew in on the twice-weekly helicopter drops, but casual access to the mountain was cut off. I was locked in. There was no leaving now. I could request evacuation, but it would take a priority incident to justify it. The creature began to change its behavior in November. It stopped doing the perimeter circuit. Instead, it started gathering at specific points. Tom had marked these locations in his logbook. He called them collection zones, places where the creature seemed to congregate, stay for extended periods, then move on. There were 5 collection zones on the property. The first was a cave system about 3 miles north, in the deep forest. Tom's notes indicated the creature spent most of its early nights there, but eventually abandoned it. The second was a stand of large aspens on the eastern ridge. Tom called it the calling ground because most of the vocalizations originated from that location. The third was along the creek bed in the northern sector, where I'd found the twisted bone. The fourth was directly north of my cabin, about 200 yards beyond the property line. The fifth didn't have a location marked. I didn't realize it immediately, but the creature was moving between these sites in a specific sequence. 3 days at the northern cave, 2 days at the aspen grove, 1 day at the creek site, and then nothing on the sensors for 2 days while it was presumably somewhere unmapped. Then it returned and started the cycle again. Understanding the pattern made it worse, not better, because now I could anticipate when it would be near the station. I could prepare, and I could also see what was happening. The creature was learning the land, mapping it out, establishing territories and routes like it had been there for years already. By mid-November, I'd stopped trying to convince myself this was anything normal. I started keeping a personal log separate from the official ranger reports. I documented everything: the sounds, the sensor activations, my observations. I included photos of the twisted bone, the tracks, the sensor readouts. I was creating evidence of something, though I still couldn't articulate what. On November 18th, something changed. The creature broke its pattern. Instead of staying at the Aspen Grove for 2 days, it came to the Grove, stayed for 6 hours, and then moved directly to the collection zone north of my cabin. It arrived at 3:22 p.m. and didn't leave. The sensor registered continuous triggering until dawn, 7 hours. Standing still, directly north of my cabin. I had my radio in my hand all night. I had my bag packed. I was ready to activate the emergency beacon if anything tried to enter the station, but nothing did. It just stood there. When dawn came, I went to the northern window with binoculars. I couldn't see anything in the forest, but I could see evidence of something: disturbed snow, broken branches, the marks of claws on tree bark, gouged deep. And there was something else. Scratched into the bark of the largest pine facing the cabin was a marking. Not scratches from climbing or feeding. Deliberate marks. It looked like a symbol. I came back inside and sat in the kitchen for a long time. I didn't cry, I didn't panic, but I understood on a level deeper than thought that something had fundamentally changed. The creature was no longer just observing me. It was establishing communication. December arrived with brutal cold. Temperatures dropped to -20. The wind became constant, screaming across the peaks and through the pines. The station's heating system worked overtime. I burned through firewood and propane at an accelerated rate, and I became obsessed with the idea of running out, of being trapped in a freezing cabin while something intelligent and hungry circled the perimeter. The helicopter drops became harder to coordinate. Weather prevented supply runs on the scheduled dates. I had 2 missed deliveries, one on December 4th, one on December 11th. I was getting by, but barely. My food supplies were adequate but not abundant, and I wasn't thinking straight. I know that now. Looking back, I can see how the isolation and fear were affecting my judgment. I was seeing connections everywhere. I was reading meaning into sounds that could have been natural. I was becoming paranoid. Or was I? The creature continued its pattern, but with variations. The sensing zones remained the same, but the timing became irregular. It would appear at the northern station at different hours, sometimes in the late afternoon, sometimes at midnight, sometimes for extended periods. Once it came to the station boundary 5 times in a single day. Each time it would stand in the same location, directly north of the cabin. And each time I would feel that sensation of being observed. I started tracking my own responses to this. Elevated heart rate, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance, depression, anxiety. I'd read enough of Tom's notes and the other rangers' documentation to understand what was happening. We were moving through stages. Stage 1 was denial and rationalization. Stage 2 was evidence gathering and obsessive tracking. Stage 3 was starting now. Stage 3 was integration. The creature was becoming normal to me, or I was becoming normal to it. The boundary between us was starting to blur. I would hear the sounds and know which zone it was occupying. I understood the pattern of its movements, and sometimes late at night I would realize I was mimicking its vocalizations. Not consciously. It would make a sound, and my mouth would try to match it. On December 19th, I found the first kill on the property. It was a mule deer, about a quarter-mile from the station, in the snow near the creek bed. The corpse was partially buried under branches, almost like it had been hidden. That was the first disturbing thing. The second was that there were no signs of predation, no tearing, no consumption. The deer was intact, but the spine was broken, deliberately broken. The creature had taken the living animal and twisted its back like Tom's twisted bone, like it was testing what it could do, like it was demonstrating. I photographed it without getting close. I reported it as an unusual wildlife death, which generated an automatic query from headquarters. I gave a standard response: natural predation, possibly a large cat. No follow-up. But I was lying, and the lie made me feel complicit in something. The next kill came 3 days later. Another deer. Different location. Different destruction pattern. This one was decapitated, but not with teeth. It was cleanly removed. Something had twisted the head until the spine severed. The precision was horrible. By December 27th, there had been 7 kills on the property. All deer. All showing signs of deliberate torture. All left in locations I would find. all placed along a rough line that ran from the northern boundary toward my cabin. The creature was building something. A map made in corpses. A message. I was breaking down. I could feel it happening, like watching a structure fail under stress. Pieces of my reasoning were becoming unstable. I wasn't eating regularly. I'd stopped maintaining the official logs. I was spending most of my time watching the windows or listening to the sounds outside. On December 31st, at midnight, the creature reached my property line. I was awake. Of course I was awake. I don't sleep anymore. I was in the main room when I heard it. Not the distant sound of the vocalizations, but actual sounds of movement. The crack of a branch under enormous weight. The scrape of claws on frozen ground. It was right at the edge of the property, maybe 50 meters from my cabin. I grabbed my flare gun and went to the window. The winter night was moonless, and the snow glowed faintly in the darkness. I could see the tree line. I could see the property boundary, and I could see the shape between the trees. It was massive, taller than I'd imagined. In the darkness it was mostly silhouette, but I could make out the proportions. Broad shoulders, long arms, a shape almost humanoid but entirely wrong. It was covered in what looked like fur or hair, matted and dark, and it was watching the cabin. It didn't move. It didn't advance. It just stood there, perfectly still, looking at the window where I was standing, looking at me. The moment stretched. Seconds became minutes. The creature didn't blink. I couldn't tell if it had eyes. The silhouette was too dark. Then it made a sound. It wasn't any of the vocalizations I'd documented. This was something different. This was a sound that came from deep in its chest, something between a growl and a word, and it was unmistakably directed at me. It was the sound of something tasting hunger. I fired the flare gun through the window. The shot lit the night. For a split second, the forest was bright as day. I got one clear image of the creature, and then it was gone. The flare was falling, and the thing had moved into the darkness of the tree line with impossible speed. I reloaded the gun and fired again, and again. 3 flares in total, each one illuminating the forest and the creature bolting away from the light. But I had seen it clearly. The face. Oh God, the face. It was wrong in ways I couldn't categorize. The proportions were almost human. Almost. The eyes were large and black, and they had intelligence behind them. The mouth was a horror. Teeth that were too long, jaws that extended further than any animal should. And the skin. There was skin under the fur, visible where it had been damaged or worn away. And that skin was gray. Not the gray of a normal animal, the gray of something that had been dead and then animated. But the worst part, the thing that made my mind reject what I was seeing, was the smell. The flare light had carried it on the wind. It was the smell of decay and hunger. It was the smell of something that had been rotting inside a body that wouldn't die. I stood at the window for an hour after the flares burned out, waiting for it to return. It didn't, but I could hear it, in the darkness beyond the property line. Circling, moving parallel to my cabin, testing the boundary, testing to see if I would cross it. I understood then what Tom's final note had been warning me about. It wasn't the creature that was the danger. It was understanding. It was knowing that something was out there that thought like you did, that planned like you did, that wanted. On January 2nd, I started hearing voices, not auditory hallucinations. I'm not going to claim I was losing my mind, though maybe I was. But the creature's vocalizations had become words. Not English words, not words in any language, but words, repeated sounds with consistent meaning. And part of my brain, the part that understood the mountain, was learning to translate them. Come, hungry, you belong. These aren't exact translations, but they were the concepts. The creature was speaking, and I was understanding. On January 5th, I wrote my goodbye letters. I wrote one to my family explaining nothing, because there was nothing I could explain. I wrote one to the ranger headquarters detailing the full logbook, the evidence, the pattern. I included the photos and the sensor data. I explained everything in detail, making sure that whoever found the records would understand what had happened, what was still happening. And then I wrote a note for my relief ranger, whoever came after me. Don't explore the northern sector. Don't investigate the sounds. Don't try to understand the creature. Acceptance is the only path. And acceptance means leaving before you understand what it is, before you start to hear it in your thoughts, before you realize that there's something beautiful in its hunger, before you want to answer the call. Don't wait like I did. Don't think you're special. Don't think you can reason with it or overcome it. It's been here longer than we have. It understands these mountains better than we ever will. And it's lonely. That's the thing nobody tells you. It's so incredibly lonely. and it reaches out to anything that has the capability to understand loneliness. Don't let it in. I couldn't help myself. I let it in. I sealed all the letters and left them in the office, on top of the official logbook. Then I did something I can't quite explain now, though it made perfect sense at the time. I opened the north door of the cabin, the one facing the forest. I stood in the doorway in the freezing darkness, and I waited. The creature didn't come immediately. For an hour I stood in that doorway, feeling the cold tear at my exposed skin, hearing the wind scream through the pines. But I could feel it. The creature was near. It was watching from the darkness, waiting to see if I would take another step. And then it made the sound, the deep, resonant call, the one that made me want to walk toward it. So I did. I walked past the property line, into the forest, toward the black shape moving between the trees. I don't remember being afraid. I was past fear. I was in a space beyond pain or survival instinct. I was just moving. The creature came closer. In the darkness I could feel it more than see it. It was enormous. Its breath was hot and acrid, and it was making sounds that I understood without needing them translated. It was welcoming me. We stood in the forest together, and for the first time in weeks, I understood why Tom had been afraid to leave, why the creature had been circling my property, why it had left the kills along a path toward my cabin. It wasn't hunting me. It was calling to something in me, something that had been waiting for permission to answer. When I woke up, I was back in the cabin. I don't know how much time had passed. The world outside was white. Snow had covered the windows. The cabin was cold, and there was blood on my hands. I can't remember what happened in the forest. There's a gap in my memory that won't fill. But I know something happened, something that changed the agreement between me and the creature, because it stopped coming to the boundary. The northern sensor never activated again. The other zones were abandoned. For 3 days I sat in that cabin, waiting for something to arrive, and nothing did. On the 4th day the helicopter came. An emergency retrieval, they said. A problem with the station's heating system had triggered automatic protocols. They were there to pick me up for maintenance purposes. I didn't fight them. I packed what I needed and got on the helicopter without looking back. The ranger who escorted me off the property asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I told him the station had been quiet. I told him the isolation had just gotten to me. I lied. And as we lifted away from Mirror Lake, I could swear I heard a sound cutting through the helicopter noise. A distant call. A voice on the wind. Not goodbye. An acknowledgement. I was debriefed by the ranger service. They read my reports. They looked at the sensor data, the photographs, the logbook. They told me I'd experienced stress-induced paranoia. They said the sensor malfunction had caused the phantom activations. They said the animal evidence suggested natural predation from a cougar or bear that had since moved on. They didn't mention the marks on the tree. I'd expected them to ask about those. They didn't. I was offered a position at another station. I turned it down. I'm done with park work. I've found other employment. I live in a city now. I'm among people. And during the day when the sun is bright and there's noise and movement, I'm fine. But at night, sometimes I hear something on the wind. It's not a sound. It's something deeper than that. It's like a frequency that reaches into my skull. And when I hear it, I remember the forest. I remember the cold. I remember the moment when I understood that the creature wasn't hunting me because it was hungry. It was reaching out because something inside me was hungry too. The ranger service eventually closed Mirror Lake Station. There was an official statement about budget constraints and restructuring. Unofficially, I heard that 3 rangers were assigned to the station over the next 8 months. Each lasted less than 2 weeks. The last ranger, I looked up his name, left his own note in the logbook. Whatever is here, it isn't evil. It's just hungry and alone, and it knows how to reach out to people who understand hunger and loneliness. Don't come to this place if you can't accept that some things we encounter in the world aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to change us. And some changes once made can't be unmade. He was right. I can feel the difference in me. Since that night in the forest, something has altered in how I experience the world. I'm separate from other people in a way I wasn't before. I hear frequencies they don't. I see patterns they miss. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I catch myself making sounds I can't control. Sounds that are almost like words, almost like answers to a call that hasn't stopped reaching across the distance. The creature is still up there, I'm sure, circling the abandoned station, waiting, learning, waiting for another ranger to arrive, waiting for another person who can hear it, waiting for another person who might understand that loneliness on that level, waiting for someone to answer. I think about going back sometimes. I think about walking into the forest and following that ancient call. I think about what waits at the end of that path, but I don't, because the creature taught me something important, even if I didn't want to learn it. The thing we should fear isn't the monsters in the dark. It's the part of ourselves that answers when they call. It's the realization that we're more like them than we want to admit. It's the knowledge that we're not running from them. We're running from ourselves. And in the mountains, in the wild places where the old world still touches the new, they understand that. They're waiting for us to stop running. They're waiting for us to recognize what we are. They're waiting for us to come home. The radio at my hip hasn't crackled in 3 days. That's not unusual for September in the Alpaca Mountains. Most hikers have moved on. The summer crowds dissolved like snowmelt. But 3 days of silence in a region where the static usually lives has a way of putting your nerves on edge. My name is Taco de Stone. I've been a park ranger in these mountains for 8 years, and I know what quiet means. Quiet means the animals have stopped moving. Quiet means the forest has noticed something we haven't. I first became aware something was wrong on the morning of September 14th. I was doing my routine patrol from the Eastern Ranger Station, checking the fire breaks and looking for any signs of illegal camping. The trail was dusty, we hadn't had rain in 2 weeks, and every footprint should have been visible. That's how I noticed the prints weren't there anymore. For 5 miles, the trail was completely clean. At first, I thought maybe the wind had swept it clear, but that doesn't happen this deep in the mountains. There's no wind that reaches the forest floor here. The canopy is too thick, and the undergrowth too dense. I knelt down and ran my fingers across the trail surface. It was smooth in a way that didn't feel natural. It felt intentional, swept, or dragged. I'd find out later which one was correct. The fire break was fine, no fallen timber, no signs of disturbance. I marked it down in my log and kept moving. The radio on my hip never made a sound, not even the standard check-in chatter from the other rangers. I assumed they were busy. I assumed a lot of things that morning that turned out to be wrong. The trail wound upward toward Miller's Pass, elevation 7,200 feet. This is where the real isolation begins. The cell towers don't reach this far, and the radio signal becomes unreliable. I'd made this walk 100 times or more. I could do it with my eyes closed. That's what I told myself anyway. Walking through a silence so complete it felt like walking through the inside of a grave. The first thing I heard was the sound of breaking branches, not the natural crack of a falling limb, but deliberate snapping, multiple branches at once. I stopped walking and listened. The sound came again from my left, maybe 30 yards into the tree line. The canopy was so dense I couldn't see more than a few feet past the perimeter of the trail. I called out, "Hey, trail's this way. The trail is marked." No response. The forest absorbed my voice completely. I'd spoken into this silence before, but never like this, never with this lack of echo. I started walking again. My hand had moved to the bear spray on my belt, not because I thought it was a bear, but because in those mountains when something deliberately hides from you, your instincts kick in, all of them. The sound followed me, not paralleling the trail, but cutting through the forest directly on my path. Whatever it wasn't trying to stay hidden. It was moving too carelessly for that. Something this heavy, moving through deadfall and thick undergrowth. It didn't care if I heard it. It didn't care that I was there. I was doing about 15 yards a minute up the trail. The sounds were keeping pace. The gap between us wasn't closing or widening. It was maintaining, deliberately matching my speed. "Hello?" I tried again. "Park ranger here. Who's out there?" The sound stopped. That was worse than the sounds continuing. Because the sound stopping meant something had made a decision. The sound stopping meant it was thinking about what I'd said. I walked for another 2 hours, and it never made a sound again. But I could feel it. I can't explain that to anyone who hasn't experienced it, but when something large has decided to track you in an isolated place, you feel it in your nervous system. Your body knows. The hair on your arms stood straight up. My skin felt like it was crawling. When I reached the ranger shelter at Miller's Pass, I made the decision to stay the night. The shelter is a small wooden structure built in the 1970s, with a wood stove, a cot, and supplies. It's supposed to be a refuge, I'd never felt less safe. I locked the door, though the lock was 20 years old and would barely slow anyone down, and made a fire. I tried the radio. The static was heavier than usual, cutting in and out with interference I'd never heard before. I couldn't reach the main station. I couldn't reach anyone. My log entry that night, September 14th, heard movement off trail near Miller's Pass, unidentified animal, possibly large elk, signs of trail disturbance, staying at shelter, will report to main station in morning. I didn't write what I really thought. I couldn't. It didn't make sense. The shelter got cold that night, but I kept the fire burning until dawn. I sat with my back to the wall, and I listened. And I heard it sometimes, a sound like something massive moving through the forest, the crack of a heavy branch, the whisper of something large brushing against tree bark. But whenever I moved toward the sound, whenever I went to the window to look, there was only darkness and silence. Around 3 a.m. I heard what sounded like something dragging something across the ground outside. It circled the shelter, an actual complete circle, and the sound took nearly 10 minutes to complete. Whatever was dragging must have been moving slowly, deliberately. The sound was loud enough to shake the walls of the shelter. I have spent 8 years in those mountains. I have never been truly afraid until that night. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through the shelter windows, I didn't wait for full light. I packed my gear and started down the trail toward the main station. The walk down took half the time. I moved fast and I didn't stop to rest. Behind me, the forest was completely silent. I reached the main station at 10 a.m. The first thing I did was file a report with the regional supervisor, Tom Hendricks. He listened to my account while leaning against his desk, his face gradually shifting from polite interest to something else. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. "You see anything?" he finally asked. "No. Just heard it." "Right, well, we've had reports, nothing concrete but reports." My blood temperature dropped about 5 degrees. "What kind of reports?" "Missing backpackers. 3 in the last 4 months, all in the northern section. All experienced hikers. All disappeared in clear weather on well-marked trails. We organized searches. Nothing. No gear, no bodies, no signs of accident. They just stopped existing." I sat down without being invited to. Why haven't I heard about this? Above my pay grade. Regional office doesn't want panic. It's still being investigated. They're saying it's probably people changing their minds about hiking and just leaving, taking different routes out. People do that. But Tom's face told me he didn't believe that. I didn't believe it either. "What do you think it is?" I asked him. Tom walked over to the window and looked out at the mountains. "I've worked here for 23 years. I've seen a lot, but I've never heard of this many people disappearing without a trace. And I've never had one of my rangers come down here looking like they just walked through hell." He was right. I could see it in the reflection of the window. I looked hollow, like something had been hollowed out from inside me while I sat in that shelter. "Take 2 weeks off," Tom said, still looking at the mountains. "Don't go back up there, not alone." I didn't argue. I took my leave the next morning, but I knew I would go back. Something in the mountains had touched my attention now, and I couldn't let it go. That was my first mistake. I spent 5 days at home trying to convince myself it was nothing. An elk. A bear. Something ordinary that had just moved through the forest. The human brain is good at rationalization. Given enough time and distance, it can convince you that anything is possible. But the more distance I put between myself and what happened, the more certain I became that something significant had occurred. Something the official channels didn't want to acknowledge. I went to the library in the nearest town, a 40-minute drive from my house, and started looking through old newspapers. The internet has made this easier and harder at the same time. Everything is archived digitally now, but nothing is organized the way it used to be. I had to search systematically. The first missing person case I found was from 15 years ago. A female hiker named Rebecca Henley, age 31, disappeared in July from the northern ridge of the Alpaca Mountains. Her car was found at the trailhead. She never came out. The search lasted 6 weeks. They found nothing. Her case was eventually closed with the assumption that she'd fallen off a cliff and her body had been carried away by scavengers. The next case was 10 years ago. 2 hikers, a couple, went into the mountains on a well-documented route. They had filed a detailed itinerary with the ranger station. They were supposed to return in 4 days. After 5 days, a search was initiated. The hikers were never found. Their tent was discovered on the 3rd day, set up in a clearing near Whisper Lake. It was completely intact. Their gear was inside. Their sleeping bags were in the tent, but they were gone. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of any kind. I found more cases. A solo male hiker in 2007, 3 backpackers in 2009, a father and son in 2011, a group of 4 experienced hikers in 2015. All disappeared in the northern section of the Alpaca Mountains, an area roughly 25 square miles bounded by Miller's Pass to the east and the Whispering Ridge to the west. No bodies, no gear left behind except in 2 cases where tents and supplies were found abandoned. No signs of predators, no evidence of accidents, just missing. I found some of the original search reports online, filed under public records. The rangers noted unusual findings. Ground that looked disturbed in ways they couldn't explain. Patterns in the underbrush that suggested something had been dragging something else. Trees marked with deep, parallel gashes like something had clawed at the bark. But the official reports all concluded the same thing. Accidental disappearance, likely due to falls, disorientation, or flash floods. None of those explanations fit what I'd experienced. I started researching something else. I began looking through hiking forums, missing person discussion boards, and regional history sites. There were accounts that never made it to the official reports, stories from hikers who'd been spooked in those mountains. A man who reported hearing something massive moving through the forest at night, something so large it sounded like a creature the size of a horse or larger. A woman who said she'd seen shadows moving between the trees, shadows with a shape that didn't quite match any animal she knew. A ranger who'd quit his job in the 1980s and later posted online that he'd experienced something in those mountains that he didn't have words for. There was one story that appeared multiple times on different forums, sometimes with slight variations. It was from someone using the handle Mountain Watcher 92. The account described a night spent in the northern section of the mountains. The writer had woken to the sound of something massive circling their camp. They described hearing heavy footfalls, the sound of branches being tested and broken, and, most disturbing, the sound of something sniffing the air around their tent. They described an odor that was overwhelming when the wind shifted, something like rotted animal flesh mixed with wet fur, and something darker, something that made them physically sick. The writer described the experience as being hunted. They said the creature had circled their camp for hours, and they believed with absolute certainty that if they had left the tent, they would have been killed. They got out of the mountains the next day and never went back. The post had over 300 responses. Most were dismissive, but some resonated with the author's experience. Several people reported similar accounts from the Alpaca Mountains, some from different mountains, but all with a consistent theme: the sense of being deliberately hunted by something intelligent and patient, something that knew how to wait. I read everything I could find: academic papers on cryptid sightings in North America, first-hand accounts from authentic sources, everything available. And the more I read, the more a picture began to form. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name people wanted to use, the accounts fit, the behavior fit. The way the creature seemed to understand human weakness, how to apply pressure, how to create fear. There were stories going back decades in these mountains, though they were always dismissed as folklore or misidentification. A massive ape-like creature, covering vast territories, intelligent and deliberate in its movements. But the disappearances were recent, concentrated, like something had changed. On my 10th day off, I made a decision. I was going back to the mountains. I was going back to the northern section, to Miller's Pass and beyond, and I was going to look for answers. I was going to document what I found. Tom Hendricks tried to talk me out of it when I told him I was ready to return. "You can take more time," he said. "No one's expecting you back." "I need to go back," I told him. "I need to understand what's happening." He looked at me for a long moment. "Dakota, if I thought I could stop you without making it an official order, I would. But I can't order you not to do your job. Just be careful and carry the satellite phone this time, not just the radio." The satellite phone. The one we were only supposed to use for emergencies, because the emergency response time from the nearest rescue service was still 2 hours minimum. But I took it. I also took a better flashlight, more supplies, and I made a decision to document everything. I went back on September 24th, 10 days after my first encounter. The forest was different when I returned. I can't explain it except to say that difference hit me the moment I stepped past the trailhead. The normal sounds of the forest, the rustle of small animals, the distant calls of jays and ravens, were absent. There was just wind through the trees and the sound of my own footsteps. I took the same route as before, up toward Miller's Pass. I moved slowly, documenting everything. I photographed areas where the trail looked disturbed. I measured distances. I was trying to approach this like a real investigation, though I had no training for this. I was just a park ranger who knew the mountains and had received training in wilderness navigation and emergency response. I wasn't qualified for what I was doing, but I did it anyway. The first unusual sign appeared about a mile up the trail. A tree, a Douglas fir about 18 inches in diameter, had been completely stripped of bark on one side. Not by deer or elk rubbing antlers. This was something else. The marks were deep and parallel, made by something with serious leverage and strength. I'd seen bears claw trees for insects, but this was different. This was deliberate scarring, marking. I found more trees like it the further I went. 23 marked trees and a rough line leading deeper into the mountains. By the time I reached Miller's Pass, I had documented evidence that suggested something was using this trail regularly. The shelter itself had been disturbed. The door lock had been tested. I could see scratch marks around the mechanism, and there were prints outside, in the dust around the shelter. I'd never seen prints like them. They were too large to be human. The toe marks showed 4 long digits and what looked like a partial fifth, a thumb. The prints were deep, suggesting serious weight. I photographed everything, took measurements. The print was roughly 17 inches long. I sat outside the shelter for hours, making notes, trying to process what I was seeing. A professional interpretation would require someone who specialized in this, but I knew what I was looking at. These were primate prints unlike anything currently recognized by zoology. As the sun began to set, I made the decision to stay in the shelter again, but this time I was prepared. I had the satellite phone and a plan to actually call for help if things went wrong. That plan would turn out to be optimistic. The sun was down by 7 p.m. I locked the shelter door, started the stove, and settled in for what I was bracing myself to be a difficult night. I had my equipment organized: flashlight, knife, bear spray, the satellite phone within arm's reach. I was ready. Nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. It started around 2 a.m. I wasn't asleep. I hadn't been able to sleep. I was sitting on the cot, staring at the darkness outside the small window, when I heard the first sound. It was like nothing I can adequately describe. It started as a low rumble. Something felt more than heard, coming up through the ground. And then it shifted into a vocalization, a sound that could have been a roar or a call or something designed to communicate. It echoed off the mountains and came back in waves. I grabbed the satellite phone with shaking hands. The sound came again, closer this time. And then I heard the movement, the heavy, deliberate movement I'd experienced before. But this time it wasn't circling at a distance. This time it was coming directly to the shelter. I could hear it testing the walls. A heavy impact on the wooden structure, like something massive was pressing against it. The shelter shifted slightly. I heard nails creak in response to the pressure. I made the call. The operator's voice came through with that odd delay satellite calls have. "Park Ranger emergency, come in. I need help. I'm at Miller's Pass shelter, and there's something here. Something large. It's testing the structure. Ranger, can you describe the situation?" Another impact hit the shelter wall. This one was harder. A window rattled. Something outside was testing our defenses with methodical precision. "There's an animal," I said, my voice barely steady. "Something large. The vocalization came again. Not a roar, not quite a howl. Something between. Something that resonated in my bones. And underneath it, I heard something else. The sound of something large sniffing, literally inhaling air around the gaps in the shelter walls. I could hear the breath being drawn in. The sound of that exhale. "Ranger, can you identify the animal?" Before I could answer, I heard wood splintering. The creature was trying to get in. Not forcefully, not yet. Deliberately testing the structure, looking for weakness. I heard the sound of claws dragging across wooden wall panels. I heard the door frame being tested. The mechanism I'd seen marked with scratch evidence before was getting worse in real time. I moved away from the walls, backing toward the center of the small shelter, keeping my eyes on every surface. The creature was circling outside. I could track its movement by the sounds, the heavy footfalls in the dirt around the perimeter, the scraping and testing of the wooden structure. "Ranger Dakota?" The operator's voice cut through the chaos. "We have a unit responding. They're approximately 80 minutes out." 80 minutes. In that moment, 80 minutes might as well have been 80 hours. The creature made the vocalization again, and I realized what the sound was for. It was calling. It was announcing that it was here, that it had found me. And then from the forest, in multiple directions, I heard responses. lower, more distant calls, but unmistakably deliberate communication. There was more than one. There are multiple, I said into the phone, though my voice sounded detached from my body, like someone else was saying the words. Multiple creatures. They're communicating with each other. The testing of the shelter intensified. Multiple impacts now from different sides. Whatever was out there, it had gathered reinforcements, and they were becoming less patient. The impacts started hitting the door. The old lock wasn't going to hold. I made the decision to light the fire brighter. The stove had a small opening where I could see the flames. I used my flashlight to enhance the brightness inside, thinking that light might deter whatever was outside. But the response was immediate. The impact stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, because now they weren't testing the structure. Now they were planning, or waiting, or something else I couldn't interpret because I didn't understand what I was dealing with. Ranger, status? The operator's voice was still calm, still professional, but I could detect something underneath it. Concern, maybe fear. They've stopped, I said. The impact stopped. That could be positive. It could mean the entire shelter moved, not from an impact, from weight being applied to the roof. Something was on top of the structure. I looked up and saw the wooden ceiling beginning to shift under pressure. Dust and debris fell. A nail came loose and clattered to the floor. The weight was incredible. Whatever was on that roof, and I was certain now it was one of the creatures, was pressing down with focused, terrible purpose. I grabbed for the bear spray, knowing it was useless, knowing that whatever this was couldn't be deterred by something designed for bears. The vocalization came again, muffled now because the creature was pressing its face against the wooden planks above me. It's on the roof, I said. It's on the shelter. It's trying to break through. Ranger, you need to. The connection went dead. The silence that followed was complete. The creature on the roof had stopped its pressure, but it didn't leave. I could hear it moving across the wooden panels, slow and deliberate, testing the structure from above, finding the weak points. I had the knife. It seemed impossibly small and useless. I had the bear spray. I had the knowledge that I was trapped in a wooden box with something intelligent and patient that was testing my defenses like a predator might test the locked door of a cage. And then it stopped moving. The silence lasted for what might have been minutes or might have been hours. Time was untrustworthy now. I sat in the center of the shelter, holding the knife, listening to my own heartbeat and the sound of wind through the trees. The fire crackled in the stove. Shadows danced against the walls. I realized what it was doing. It was waiting for me to sleep. It was waiting for me to exhaust myself, to let my guard down, to assume that the danger had passed, and then it would try again. This was sophisticated behavior. This was planning. This was predation on a level that most animals aren't capable of. The sun didn't come for a long time. When it finally did, when gray light began to filter through the window, the creature vocalized one more time. A long, low call that resonated with a finality that made me think it was saying goodbye, or perhaps stating a promise that this wasn't over. I heard it move away from the shelter, heavy footfalls retreating into the forest. The sound faded gradually, along with the response calls from the other creatures. I waited until full daylight. Then I packed everything I could carry and I left. I didn't walk the trail. I bushwhacked directly down the mountain in a near straight line, knowing this was dangerous, knowing I could fall, knowing that moving off-trail in the Alpaca Mountains is a survival risk. But I didn't care. I needed out. I made it to the base camp in just under 4 hours, moving in a state of controlled panic. I didn't stop for water or rest. I just moved. When I reached the main ranger station, I was incoherent. Tom Hendricks found me sitting on the steps of the building, unable to speak in complete sentences. He took me inside and got me water, and eventually I could tell him what had happened. He didn't doubt me. That was the only mercy in that situation. He didn't express skepticism or suggest rational explanations. He just listened and then made calls to regional management. The response was immediate and total. Within hours, the entire northern section of the Alpaca Mountains was marked off limits. An official statement was issued citing maintenance concerns and unstable terrain. The ranger stations were staffed with people from the regional office. Every trail into the northern section was rerouted or closed. I was given paid leave and told not to discuss what had happened. Confidentiality was emphasized strongly, repeatedly, but people talked anyway. The other rangers knew, the administrative staff knew, word filtered out into the broader community. Rumors began circulating, and I know that stories have leaked to the internet. mixing with all the other accounts and rumors and folklore about the Alpaca Mountains. It's been 6 months since that night at Miller's Pass. I am no longer a park ranger. The decision was mutual. They wanted me gone, and I wanted out. Continuing to work in those mountains, knowing what's there, knowing what I encountered and what I failed to convey adequately to anyone who could actually do something about it, became psychologically impossible. I live in a house near the town now, far enough from the mountains that I can't see them from my window. That was intentional. During the first weeks after what happened, I couldn't sleep. The dreams were worse than insomnia. I would replay that night, the sounds, the sense of something intelligent and patient testing my ability to survive. I've tried to talk about this with medical professionals. I've explained what I experienced, detailed the evidence I collected, showed them the photographs. The response has been consistent: post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, possibly a stress-induced psychological episode. Not one of them has suggested that what I described could be real. Not one of them has taken seriously the possibility that something in those mountains, something substantial and documentable, could explain the dozens of missing people over the past 15 years. But the evidence is there. The photographs exist. The satellite phone logs exist showing the emergency call I made. The scratches on the shelter door are real, and the official closure of the northern section of the Alpaca Mountains is documented fact, even if the public reason given is maintenance concerns. I have spent the last 6 months researching, reading, trying to understand what I encountered, and whether anyone else has ever adequately documented it. There are organizations that investigate these things, cryptozoological research groups, missing person advocacy networks, people who take this seriously even when the mainstream does not. I've been in contact with some of them. I've shared information. I've told my story, and gradually a picture has emerged from the combined testimonies and reports. It's not a picture that brings comfort. The creatures in the Alpaca Mountains, and I am now convinced there are multiple of them, are not the simple animals that the historical folklore presents. They are not mindless beasts that lumber through the forest. They are intelligent. They are social, they communicate with each other, and they understand humans in a way that suggests they have been studying us as much as we've been trying to understand them. The disappearances follow patterns. Missing people are often solo or in very small groups. They go missing in remote areas with few witnesses. The disappearances cluster in specific seasons, usually late summer through early fall. And there is a concentration point, the northern section of the Alpaca Mountains. One theory that has been circulating in the research community suggests that these creatures may understand human behavior well enough to exploit it. Hikers in that region tend to be experienced and self-reliant. They underestimate danger because they've hiked many times before without incident. They don't carry satellite communication in many cases. They assume that accidents, if they occur, will be minor, and then something in those mountains finds them. I've read cases of animals that understand the human relationship with violence and territory. Certain big cats have been documented not just killing but hunting humans with apparent understanding of human weakness, but that level of behavior is usually attributed to experienced hunters, animals that have killed humans before and understand how to do it again. The creatures in the Alpaca Mountains appear to be conducting an active research project. Observing humans, testing responses, learning. The thought that keeps me awake now is different from the thoughts that kept me awake immediately after my encounter. Then I was afraid of what would happen next. Now I'm afraid of what's already happening. There are thousands of people who hike in these mountains. The closure of the northern section keeps most of them out, but the boundaries are not absolute. People still go there, some specifically seeking the mysteries, some simply unaware of the closure, and people continue to disappear. I have been approached by people who want me to lead them to the location, paranormal researchers, cryptid hunters, people convinced that I've experienced something worth documented. I have refused all requests. I would not take anyone back to those mountains, not because I'm afraid of what would happen to me, though I am, but because I have seen what happens to people who encounter these creatures unprepared. I have seen the evidence of their intelligence and their patience. I think about the families of the missing. 16 names. That's how many documented missing people have disappeared in the Alpaca Mountains region in the last 20 years. 16 people who didn't come back. 16 families who never got closure or answers, and I know what took them. I know what's waiting in the deep forest where the cell towers don't reach and the ranger patrols are scarce, but I can't prove it in the way that matters. I can't show it to the skeptics and the doubters. I can only tell what happened to me, and hope that someone listens. The satellite phone sits in a drawer in my bedroom. I kept it, though I shouldn't have. Sometimes on bad nights I look at it and think about trying the call again, trying to reach someone who will understand. But I know how that would sound. A man alone, having moved away from his employment, making emergency calls about creatures that don't officially exist. I would be dismissed, pathologized, ignored. So I remain silent except for these words, this testimony. I know how it sounds. I know the skepticism it will generate. But I also know the truth of what I experienced. I know that something is in the Alpaca Mountains, something intelligent, something patient, something that understands humans well enough to hunt us with focus and purpose. I know that people continue to disappear there, and the official response is to deny the pattern and close access to the region. I know that 8 years ago, I was a man who believed in the documented world, in evidence, in explanation. I believed that anything real could be proven and acknowledged. That man no longer exists. I have been fundamentally altered by contact with something that exists outside the boundaries of what society has agreed to acknowledge. I think about going back sometimes. Not to the mountains, I couldn't force myself to do that, but to the organizations that investigated what happened. The search teams, the regional management, the people who know more than they're allowed to say. Because I am certain now that people in official positions know. They know about the creatures, they know about the disappearances. They have chosen to respond by denial and closure rather than by acknowledgement and protection. And perhaps that's the right choice. Perhaps the truth would cause panic. Perhaps it's safer to let the mountains remain unexplained. But I can't live with that choice. Not anymore. So I tell this story. Not for belief, not for validation, but as a record, as testimony, as documentation that something exists in the Alpaca Mountains, something beyond our current framework of accepted reality. And it is hunting us with patience and understanding that rivals our own. The mountains are still there, and something in them is still waiting. That is the only truth I am certain of anymore. That and the fact that I will never be the same. I've been a ranger in the Alpaca Mountains for 17 years. 17 years of winter storms that crack trees like bones, of search and rescue operations that end in ways you never talk about at the station, of learning to read the land the way most people read their own hands. But nothing in those 17 years prepared me for what I encountered on November 15th, when the temperature dropped to 23 degrees and the wind moved through the valley like something with intention. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what happened in Sector 7, the Northern Ridge territory that borders the steep canyon where Lost Creek runs. They call it Lost Creek because 3 people disappeared in the 1980s trying to kayak through. Their bodies were never recovered. I'd always assumed the creek itself was dangerous. Fast water, hidden rocks, the kind of place where nature is indifferent to human life. But that November I began to understand that water was the least of what lived in that place. The evening started ordinarily enough. I was doing a perimeter check before the seasonal lockdown of the northern access roads. Winter in the Alpacas isn't for casual visitors. The passes fill with snow by December, and we restrict access to only the essential research station and emergency services. My job was to confirm all the equipment was secure, the warning signs were posted, and nothing was blocking the roads. A routine evening patrol that should have taken 3 hours, maybe less. I drove my Ranger truck up the Ridge Road around 4:30. When the light was already turning gray. The forecast called for clear skies, but the weather in the Alpacas is like a liar. It tells you one thing and does another. The truck's heater rattled as I climbed elevation, and the radio crackled with the evening weather update from base camp. Cold front moving in faster than expected. Visibility would be good for another few hours. Then the fog would roll. That's when I should have turned back. That's the detail I replay in my head during the insomnia sessions that come now 3 times a week. The fog advisory, the cold front, the way the light was dying too fast. But I didn't turn back. The road was clear, and I'd driven it 100 times before. The Northern Ridge was my territory, the section of the park I knew better than any place on earth, except maybe my own house. I knew which pullouts had the best views. I knew which sections of fence needed repair. I knew the radio tower that sat at the highest point like some skeletal guardian watching the valley below. I didn't know what else knew that place. That's what I know now. The truck climbed past the 6,000-foot marker. The rock formations on either side of the road began to take on strange shadows in the fading light, all sharp angles and deep crevices where the sun couldn't reach. This is a section of the park that most rangers don't love. Beautiful in a brutal way, but it feels separate from the rest. The canyon walls are too high. The trees grow too twisted. The silence is the kind that presses against your eardrums. I pulled into the northern observation point around 5 o'clock. The thermometer on my truck read 19 degrees. The sun was a red line on the western horizon, and I had maybe 40 minutes of usable light. I shut off the engine and stepped out to do the equipment check, mainly just confirming the weather station was recording data and the communication relay wasn't covered in ice or debris. That's when I heard it. Not immediately. First, I noticed the lack of sound. No birds, no wind in the trees. The silence was absolute and complete, the kind that feels unnatural. I've worked in wilderness long enough to know that silence like that usually means animals sense something. Predator approaching, earthquake coming, change in the weather that the instruments haven't detected yet. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, listening. The silence continued. Then it broke. The sound came from somewhere deep in the canyon below. A call or a cry or something between the two. It wasn't animal. I've heard elk bugling, bears vocalizing, coyotes calling across the ridges. This was none of those things. It was almost human. Almost. But there was something underneath it. Something that made my hindbrain scream at me to move, to run, to get back in the truck and drive away as fast as the steep mountain roads would allow. It sounded like someone in extreme pain mixed with something that might have been rage, but filtered through an entirely different kind of throat than any human or animal I knew. A wet, clicking quality to it. Long and drawn out. The kind of sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest rather than entering through my ears. I did get back in the truck. My hands were shaking. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off listening. The sound didn't come again. The silence returned, but it was different now, charged with something. Expectant. I should have driven down the mountain then. That's what the part of my brain that had been trained in ranger protocols told me to do. Report the sound, recommend an investigation, document everything. But another part of me, a part 1V since learned to distrust, was curious. Curiosity is supposed to be a positive trait. In the wilderness, it's often what gets you killed. I drove up the road instead of down. The road continues past the observation point, climbing another 1,000 feet to the radio tower and the research station. The station was closed for the season. The team that monitors water quality and atmospheric data wouldn't be back until spring. But there was always the possibility that something or someone was out here that shouldn't be. A stranded hiker maybe, someone injured. That's what I told myself. The road narrowed as I climbed. The forest on either side became denser, the trees so thick in places that my headlights barely penetrated the darkness between them. The thermometer dropped to 15 degrees. The sky above the ridgeline was darkening from red to purple to black. I was running out of light faster than I'd anticipated. The radio tower appeared out of the gloom first, that skeletal framework of metal and insulators and blinking red safety lights that marked the highest point on the ridge. The research station was just beyond it, a prefab structure that looked more like a construction trailer than a building. Aluminum siding, small windows, a propane tank secured to the north side, no lights, no signs of life. I parked 30 feet from the station and killed the engine. The heater cut out, and the silence returned immediately. Not the normal silence of a closed, empty building in the wilderness. Something else. Something that felt like holding your breath. I grabbed my flashlight and my radio. Standard protocol: announce your location, confirm you're secure, identify your purpose. I keyed the radio. Ranger Command, this is Sector 7 on Ridge Patrol. I'm at the northern station for perimeter check. Weather holding, we'll complete the round and head back down. Static for a moment. Then Tommy's voice came through from base camp, distant but clear. Copy that. Station secure? No issues? I looked at the dark structure, the empty windows, the way the propane tank seemed to loom larger in the shadows. Looks secure from the outside, I said. Doing visual confirmation now. Copy. You've got maybe 20 minutes of usable light. Keep it brief and head back down before the fog rolls. Already planned on it. I signed off and pocketed the radio. The night air bit at my exposed skin as I walked toward the station. My breath came out in white clouds. The beam of my flashlight showed frost already forming on the metal siding. It was getting cold fast. The door to the station was locked, which was correct. I checked the windows, all secure, nothing disturbed. The equipment inside looked untouched. I did a walk around of the building, checking for any signs of break-in or animal damage. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. Everything was wrong. As I walked the perimeter, I became increasingly aware of the darkness pressing in around the small circle of my flashlight. The canyon walls weren't visible anymore, just the suggestion of them, darker spaces in the darkness. The few scattered trees between the station and the canyon edge were like black lines drawn against the night sky. And somewhere in that darkness, something was watching me. I don't say that metaphorically. I could feel it. That primitive part of your brain, the part that's more ancient than language, the part that drove your ancestors away from the savannah when a lion looked in their direction, that part was screaming at me. The hair on my arms was standing up despite the heavy ranger coat. My stomach was knotted. I should have left then, should have gotten back in the truck and driven down, but I heard the sound again, from the canyon, from somewhere down in that massive darkness below the ridge. It came in short bursts this time, not quite a howl, not quite a shriek. Something in between, the kind of vocalization that suggested a throat designed for something other than human speech, and underneath it, barely audible, was something else. A wet sound, clicking, like the noise a lobster makes when its shell cracks, multiplied and echoing off the canyon walls. That's when I realized I was alone, completely, utterly alone. The nearest ranger station was 5 miles down the mountain. The nearest town was 40 minutes away. No cell service on the ridge, the mountains kill signals. If something happened, if I called on the radio, it would take at least 30 minutes for anyone to reach me. In winter, climbing these roads, probably longer. I walked quickly back to the truck. Not running. I somehow knew that running would be wrong, would trigger something, but moving with purpose, with urgency. My eyes stayed on the truck, not on the darkness pressing in from all sides. The second sound came just as my hand touched the door handle. Closer this time, much closer. It started as that half-human wail, but then transformed into something that made my teeth ache, a screech that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate in my skull. It was rage and hunger and something that might have been laughter, all mixed together. I got in the truck. The door closed with a heavy, solid sound. I started the engine. It turned over immediately, thank God, thank whatever force in the universe protects fools from the consequences of their poor decisions. And I did a 3-point turn. The headlights swung across the canyon, and for just a moment they caught something. Movement. Something large and impossible moving through the rocks below the ridge. Then the headlights were pointing down the mountain road, and I didn't look back. I drove with my foot heavy on the accelerator, pushing the truck as fast as the narrow, winding road would safely allow. 40 miles per hour. 45. The speedometer climbed as I descended, gravity and fear both pulling me down the mountain. The engine labored, and the brakes began to overheat from the constant downhill pressure. That sound followed me. Not getting closer, it was still somewhere in the canyon, somewhere deep in that massive darkness, but not fading either. It would call out, and the canyon would echo it back, and I'd hear it multiple times as the sound bounced off the rock walls. Each call seemed angrier than the last. Each one carried the unmistakable weight of something that knew I was fleeing and was displeased by my departure. Halfway down the ridge, the fog rolled in. One moment I could see the road stretching ahead of me in the truck's headlights. The next moment, white walls of mist swallowed the world. I couldn't see more than 15 feet ahead. I eased off the accelerator and adjusted my grip on the steering wheel. The fog was cold and wet and seemed almost alive. The way it pressed against the windshield. The sound stopped. I realized only then how much the constant wailing had been driving me, how my shoulders were hunched and my jaw was clenched. When the sound finally cut off, the sudden silence was almost more frightening than the noise had been. Had it gone away, or had it decided to stop calling? Was it moving? Was it doing something in the darkness that required silence? The fog made the last 5 miles of descent feel like hours. I crawled down the road, following the edge markers and relying on muscle memory and fear to keep the truck on the pavement. Every shadow in the fog looked like it contained something large. Every sound the truck made, the crunch of gravel, the whisper of tires on asphalt, seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I reached the ranger station at just past 7 o'clock. The lights from the building had never looked so welcoming. I parked the truck in its usual spot and sat there, hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to breathe normally and failing. Tommy found me there 5 minutes later when he came to lock up for the evening. "Hey, you look like hell," he said, peering through the driver's side window. I rolled the window down with shaking hands. What happened up there? I told him about the sounds. I didn't tell him about the feeling of being watched, or the shape I might have seen in my headlights, or the way my entire nervous system had screamed danger for the last 20 minutes of the drive down. Rangers are trained observers, but they're also trained skeptics. Tell a colleague you saw something in the darkness and you'll find yourself the subject of every joke at the station for months. Instead, I told him there was unusual animal activity. Possibly a bear, though that was unlikely in November. Possibly something that had been injured and was vocalizing its distress. Could be nothing, could be worth investigating during daylight hours. Tommy nodded, accepted the explanation, and didn't push further. We locked up the station together. I drove home in near silence, the radio off, my hands still shaking on the wheel. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen with all the lights on, drinking coffee and not thinking about what I'd heard, what I might have seen, what felt like intelligent attention in the darkness of that canyon. By morning I'd almost convinced myself it had been nothing. A large animal, an unusual acoustic phenomenon caused by wind and canyon formation, the power of imagination amplified by isolation and darkness, the kind of things that happen to people who spend too much time alone in the wilderness. I was wrong. I didn't know it yet, but my life had fundamentally changed on that ridge. The encounter wasn't over, it was just beginning. And the worst part, the detail that would haunt me through the months and years that followed, was that whatever I'd encountered didn't seem to be leaving the Alpaca Mountains. It seemed to be becoming more active, more aggressive, more interested in me. The sounds returned 2 nights later. I was home, in my house in Timber Ridge Town, which sits in the valley 40 minutes below the ranger station. My house is a small cabin, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, built in the 1970s by someone who understood that in mountains like these, walls need to be thick and windows need to be strong. I'd spent the evening doing paperwork, documenting the November 15th patrol in the incident log, keeping the description vague and professional. I was in bed around 11 when I heard it. Not the same intensity as on the ridge, filtered through distance and the closed windows and the thick walls of the cabin, but unmistakably the same vocalization, a wailing cry that started almost human and descended into something entirely other. It came from somewhere in the forest behind my house, maybe a quarter mile away, in the darkness where the national forest begins. I got up. I'm not sure why, some instinct that overrode my better judgment. I walked to the back window and looked out into the darkness. The forest behind the cabin is mostly pine and fir, old growth with trees that are easily 100 years or more. My floodlights illuminated the edges of it but couldn't penetrate the dense interior. I stood at the window, looking into that darkness, and tried to see what I might hear. The sound came again, closer this time. And this time, I heard something else beneath it. Movement. Large, heavy, moving through the underbrush with no attempt at stealth. Whatever was making these sounds wasn't trying to hide. It was moving with purpose, with directness, cutting straight through the forest in a way that something large and powerful would move when it didn't need to avoid obstacles. I grabbed my rifle from the closet, a .308 Winchester, my hunting rifle, the one I'd never had to fire in any serious situation, and I loaded it. My hands were steady, at least. Years of training. You don't panic when you're trained to respond to threats. You function. Your brain shifts into a different mode. But underneath that professional calm, something deeper was responding to what was happening. Something that knew this was wrong. This was impossible. This wasn't fitting the pattern of anything wildlife I understood. The sound cut off as suddenly as it had begun. I stood in my back hallway with the loaded rifle, listening to the silence. It stretched out for 5 minutes, 10. The night returned to normal, the normal sounds of a forest night, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind in the trees, the creak of a house settling. But that deeper sense that something was wrong remained. I never went back to bed that night. The next morning I filed a report. Unusual vocalization heard near residential area. Possible bear or mountain lion, though the vocalizations were atypical for either species. Recommended additional patrols of the forest access points. I documented it officially, because that's what you're supposed to do. But I didn't tell anyone that the sound was the same as what I'd heard on the ridge. I didn't mention the feeling of intentional movement through the forest. I kept it professional, documented, explainable. But I also went to the ranger station library and pulled every wildlife record for the Alpaca Mountains going back 10 years. I looked through incident reports, documented sightings, animal encounters that had required intervention. Most of it was standard: bears raiding garbage, hikers injured by falls, the occasional aggressive mountain lion that needed to be relocated. Nothing unusual, nothing that matched what I'd heard. It was Tommy who first brought up the history. He found me sitting at the desk with the old incident files spread out, and he dropped a folder on top of them. "You really spooked by what you heard the other night?" he asked. He was trying to keep his tone light, but there was an edge beneath it. Something about my behavior had registered as wrong. "Documenting patterns," I said. "Standard ranger response. Log everything, identify patterns, establish protocols." Tommy sat down across from me. He's about 15 years older than me, a lifer at the station, the kind of ranger who spends more time in the wilderness than in civilization. "You ever hear about the disappearances?" he asked. I had. Everyone had. The 2 hikers in 1998 who went missing on the ridge and were never found despite a massive search. The research team member in 2003 who went to collect water samples at Lost Creek and didn't return. The solo kayaker in 2009 who was never located. 4 disappearances in 11 years, all in the northern sector. "Wildlife," he said. "Most likely. Or accidents. People fall, get injured, die in the wilderness. It happens. But the thing is, none of those disappearances are quite normal. The searches never found bodies. No gear, no remains. It's like the mountain just swallowed them." "Mountain retrieves about a dozen bodies a year from accidents," I said. "The disappearances are anomalies. Doesn't mean something else is happening." "Maybe not," Tommy said. He tapped the file he'd brought over. "But there's something else. Before the disappearances, there were sightings. Stuff people reported to the park office, mostly by visitors and researchers. Sounds they couldn't identify. The feeling of being watched. One researcher documented audio recordings she made at the northern station. She said there were vocalizations in the recordings that she couldn't identify. She was going to do a full study, bring in specialists, but she quit the project and transferred to a different region before she finished. No one really knows why." "Where's the recording?" I asked. "Gone," Tommy said. "She took her files with her, but the incident report is in the archive." She described the vocalizations as not matching any known animal in North America. Her exact words. I sat back in my chair. I wasn't realizing in that moment that I was already being pulled deeper, that the investigation itself was becoming a trap, that my need to understand was driving me toward something I should have been running from. I only knew that the piece of the puzzle Tommy had just provided fit too perfectly with what I'd experienced. "I want to see the archive," I said. "Figured," Tommy said. "I pulled it for you. Fair warning though, the higher-ups don't like attention on the northern sector. It's bad for the park's reputation. Any official inquiry has to go through the director, and she's not going to approve a full investigation into something that's probably just animal behavior and coincidence." "I'm not asking for an official investigation," I said. "Just research." Tommy nodded like he understood, but there was concern in his expression. "Just be careful," he said. "The mountains are beautiful, but they're not friendly, especially up there on the ridge." He left me with the archive folder. It contained incident reports dating back to 1992, not just the major disappearances, but dozens of smaller reports. Hikers who reported being followed but saw nothing. Researchers who documented unusual tracks that didn't match any identified species. Audio files of vocalizations. Weather Service observations that didn't explain storm patterns or atmospheric anomalies. It was like looking at a picture of something when you only get to see it one piece at a time, never the whole thing. I photographed the documents on my phone and spent the next 3 days reading through everything multiple times. I created a timeline. I tried to identify patterns beyond the disappearances. What I found was a mountain that seemed to have a secret, a place where things didn't behave the way wildlife is supposed to behave, a location that, if you looked at the records carefully enough, seemed to be gradually increasing in unusual activity. The reports from 1992 to 1996 were sparse. 2 or 3 a year, mostly documentation of odd sounds or tracks. Then from 1997 to 2001, the frequency increased. Researchers documenting audio samples. Park rangers reporting areas where animals seemed to avoid. Then came the disappearances, and the frequency spiked. After 2009, things quieted down. Fewer reports, less official attention, a general quiet that had lasted until my encounter on the ridge. That's when I realized something. The quiet hadn't been because the activity had stopped. It had been because people had learned to avoid that area. The northern sector, once popular with backpackers and researchers, had gradually become less visited, not because it was officially discouraged, but because people felt it. That same instinct that had driven me down the mountain in a panic. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Whatever was up there, it was real, it was smart, and it had learned to maintain a careful balance, active enough to drive people away, not so active that a full investigation was launched. It was, in a way, managing its own safety. That terrified me more than the sounds had. The third encounter came 5 days after the incident at my house. I'd requested a daytime patrol of the northern sector, ostensibly to check for downed trees and damage from the recent windstorm. I drove up the ridge road in bright sunlight with Tommy following in a separate truck. The intention was to make it official, documented, safe. 2 rangers, open investigation, everything on the books. The road was clear. The weather was perfect, clear blue sky, temperature in the high 30s, wind minimal. In daylight, the ridge was beautiful in that severe way the alpacas are beautiful. I saw deer, a family of elk, the remains of what might have been a mountain lion kill, decomposed enough that I couldn't identify the prey. All normal mountain ecology. We reached the northern station around noon. The structure was exactly as I'd left it, secure and undisturbed. We did a thorough walkthrough, checked the equipment, reviewed the monitoring data that had been collected since my last visit, confirmed everything was functioning properly. Then we split up to check different sections of the ridge road for damage. I took the western section, driving slowly and stopping periodically to walk and visually inspect the asphalt. The road was good, no washouts, no significant debris. I was starting to relax. The daylight had broken the spell that the night had cast. In the sun, the mountain was just a mountain. The sounds I'd heard could be explained. Things were rational again. That's when I found the smear. It was on the road about 200 meters from where I'd left the truck, on the eastbound side of the pavement. A dark streak about 6 inches wide and 3 feet long that looked like something had been dragged. I knelt down to examine it closer. It was blood. Old blood, probably several days old, dried to a dark brown on the asphalt. I immediately called Tommy on the radio and asked him to come to my location. "What have you got?" he asked over the static. "Something. Maybe a kill site. Animal drag marks. Blood. Need another set of eyes." He was there in 5 minutes. He examined the blood and the drag marks, and I watched his expression change. Not quite fear, but respect. The kind of expression someone gets when they're looking at evidence of something large and powerful. "This is recent," he said. "Probably within the last week. Something killed something here and dragged it away from the road. Into the forest," I said. "Yeah, into the forest." We followed the blood trail. It was subtle. You had to look carefully to see it. A few drops here, a smear there, vegetation disturbed. But the pattern was clear. Something had made a kill on the road, and something else, or the same something, had dragged the carcass away. The trail led us about 100 meters into the forest, into an area of dense undergrowth and old fallen logs. It ended abruptly in a clearing. The blood was more concentrated here, a larger stain on the ground where whatever had been killed had probably expired. But the carcass was gone. Either scavengers had taken it, or the same thing that had killed it had moved it again. "This is a kill site," Tommy said, stating the obvious but needing to say it. "A predator took something here." "Elk calf?" I offered. "Lion or bear?" "Maybe, but it's aggressive. Dragging prey off the road like that. Most animals would feed near the kill. The fact that it moved the carcass." He trailed off, not wanting to complete the thought. "What?" I asked. "Nothing. Just unusual behavior. Could indicate a young animal, inexperienced. Could indicate a predator defending its food source." He paused. "Could indicate something territorial, something that wants to hide what it kills." We didn't discuss what else it could indicate. We were both thinking it, but acknowledging it would mean escalating this from an observation to a serious problem, and neither of us was ready for that. We reported the kill site back to base, documented it with photos, and completed our patrol. The rest of the ridge was clear, no other evidence of unusual activity. But the unease between Tommy and me had deepened. We both knew that a kill site on the road, with the carcass deliberately removed, was not something any animal we knew would do. That night, I listened to recordings. I went back to the incident reports and found the audio file that the researcher from 2003 had compiled. It was stored on an old CD in the archive, the kind that's common in government offices but increasingly rare everywhere else. I had to dig out a CD player from storage to listen to it. The audio was low quality, presumably recorded on equipment available to a researcher in 2003. But once you adjusted for the distortion, the sounds were unmistakable. The same vocalizations I'd heard on the ridge, the same wailing cry with the clicking undertone. I played the recording 12 times. 12 times, trying to identify any component that could be explained as a known animal. Elk bugling, bears vocalizing, coyotes, wolves, big cats. None of it matched. The closest comparison might have been to vocalizations of primates. Something about the structure of the cry suggested a mammal designed for complex vocalization. But the clicking underneath, the wet quality, the incredible volume that the recording preserved even through its degradation, that was something else. I created a folder on my computer labeled Research. I collected photographs of the drag marks, the blood stain, the incident reports, the audio data. I started researching missing persons in the tri-state region over the past 20 years, cross-referencing hiking trips and national park visits with disappearances. The numbers were higher than I'd expected. Dozens of cases where hikers or visitors had gone missing in mountain regions and never been found. Some of them were in the alpacas. This is when I should have stopped. This is the point where, if I'd been thinking clearly, I should have gone to the authorities, taken my evidence to the park director, filled out formal reports, let professionals investigate. But I was already trapped in the same way the mountain had trapped others. By curiosity, by the need to understand, by the certainty that I'd stumbled onto something significant. The fourth encounter came exactly 1 week after the Ridge Patrol. I was alone this time. I'd decided that I needed to investigate the northern sector more thoroughly to understand what I was dealing with. I'd checked the weather, clear skies, good visibility, temperature expected to stay above freezing throughout the day. I'd filed a routine patrol report with the station, mentioning that I'd be doing a detailed sweep of the Northern Territory for potential wildlife hazards. I'd also loaded my rifle, loaded a second magazine, and strapped a knife to my belt. I'd done this without really thinking about it, on instinct. Whatever I was preparing for, it was something that my subconscious understood I might need to defend myself against. I drove up the ridge road and parked at the observation point. From there I planned to hike into the canyon following Lost Creek, to the point where the 2003 researcher had been collecting water samples when she went missing. It was a popular location according to the archives, a place where the creek formed natural pools and the canyon walls weren't as sheer, a place where in summer people would swim and fish. But this was late November. The creek would be cold, the canyon would be isolated. I hiked down the trail that led into the canyon following the switchbacks that descended 1,000 feet. The forest changed as I lost elevation. The high elevation firs gave way to aspens and younger pines. The air became slightly warmer, but not by much. Everything was still locked in the grip of approaching winter. Lost Creek appeared after about 40 minutes of hiking. The water was running high and fast from the seasonal runoff, turbid with sediment. The canyon walls rose on either side, creating a narrow passage that the creek had carved over millions of years. The sound of the water echoed off the rock, creating a constant white noise that made it difficult to hear anything else. I followed the creek upstream, moving carefully on the rough terrain. The canyon walls were unstable in places, loose rock, crumbling banks where the winter freeze-thaw cycle was doing its work. I was 50 meters into the canyon when I found the gear. It was wedged in a crevice in the rock wall, about 3 meters up from the ground. A backpack, canvas, old style, the kind that had been common before modern outdoor equipment. I stared at it for a long moment, not immediately processing what I was seeing. Then I understood. This was from the researcher who'd gone missing in 2003. This backpack had been here for 19 years, undisturbed, impossible to find unless you were specifically looking in this location. And I'd found it by following an instinct I couldn't explain. I climbed up to the crevice and retrieved the pack. It was surprisingly intact. The dry canyon air had preserved it. Inside, I found waterproof containers with equipment, water testing vials, a notebook, a camera, climbing gear, all the tools of a researcher, all the possessions of someone who'd vanished. I opened the notebook. The entries were dated from April 2003, the month she'd gone missing. The first entries were standard observation notes, water samples collected, pH readings, temperature measurements. The voice in the writing was professional, analytical, but as the entries progressed, something changed. By mid-April, the tone was becoming increasingly concerned. She was documenting vocalizations she was hearing at night, sounds that she couldn't identify. She'd set up a recording device in the canyon and captured audio. The sounds were unlike anything in her training or experience. The final entries, dated April 20th, became almost frantic. "The sounds are coming closer. I've heard them 4 nights in a row. They're not from any animal I can identify. The spectral analysis of the audio shows vocalizations with frequency ranges that shouldn't be possible for any mammal in North America. I've been documenting everything, but I need to present this to someone who can actually investigate. The danger here is real. I can feel it. Something in this canyon is not right. Something is wrong here. I'm packing out tomorrow morning, no matter what the schedule says. I need to get out. The last entry was dated April 21st. It was only 2 words. It's here. I sat in that canyon, holding a 19-year-old notebook written by a woman who'd disappeared, and I understood that I was looking at a record of someone's final moments. She'd come here to research something unusual. She'd encountered something, and whatever she'd encountered, it had ended with those 2 words. It's here. I pocketed the notebook and examined the rest of the contents. The camera was broken, the lens was shattered, the interior filled with crystallized corrosion. I couldn't recover any images. The climbing gear looked normal. But there was one other thing in the pack that caught my attention: a plastic waterproof container. Inside it was a sample vial, labeled in handwriting, "Unknown specimen, collected April 15th, 03. The vial contained something that might have been hair or fur. It was longer than human hair, with a different texture, coarser, almost wiry. The color was dark, almost black. I'd never seen anything like it before. I was so focused on the contents of the backpack that I almost didn't hear the sound. It came from deeper in the canyon, downstream, where the walls narrowed and the creek disappeared into what looked like a crack in the earth. The sound was faint, muted by distance and the echo of the flowing water, but unmistakable. Clicking. Wet, rhythmic clicking, like bones breaking or shells cracking. I packed everything back into the container and climbed down from the crevice. The sound continued, sporadic but consistent. I wasn't afraid, not yet. I was focused, alert, operating on adrenaline and the strange calm that comes from engaging with something you've been obsessing over. I walked toward the sound, following the creek deeper into the canyon. The walls became higher as I progressed, 200 feet high, then 300. The sky became a thin line of blue far above. The creek flowed faster here, more turbulent. The clicking sound grew slightly louder, but still muted, like it was coming from a significant distance away. I was searching for its source, following the canyon as it twisted deeper into the mountain. I nearly didn't see the opening. It was hidden behind a sharp bend in the canyon, a dark opening in the rock wall about 4 feet high and 6 feet wide. A cave entrance, unremarkable except for one thing. The ground around it was marked with what looked like tracks. They were large. They didn't match anything I'd ever seen in the Alpaca Mountains. The shape suggested a foot, but the dimensions were wrong, too large. The spacing between the prints indicated a bipedal gait, like something walking upright. And they were fresh. The silt in the canyon floor still showed clear depressions, undisturbed by water or wind. Hours old, maybe less. The clicking sound seemed to be coming from inside the cave. I stood at the entrance, rifle held ready, every survival instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. This was the place. This was where it lived. Whatever had killed the researcher in 2003, whatever had made the kill site I'd found on the ridge, whatever had called to me from the darkness multiple times, it lived here, in this cave, deep in the canyon of Lost Creek. I should have left. I should have climbed out of that canyon and driven back to town and reported everything to the authorities, but I was paralyzed by curiosity, by the need to see, by the obsession that had been driving me since that first night on the ridge. I had my flashlight, I had my rifle, I had a knife, and I had the certainty that if I didn't go into that cave now, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd avoided. I turned on my flashlight and entered the cave. The opening was narrow, forcing me to crouch as I moved deeper. The rock was slick. Water ran down the walls from somewhere further in. The temperature dropped as I progressed, becoming cold enough that I could see my breath. The clicking sound had stopped, which was somehow worse than when I could locate it. The cave opened into a larger chamber after about 30 feet. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating walls that were surprisingly smooth. Not carved. Caves don't have carved walls, but worn smooth by water and time. I stood in the center of the chamber, my light playing across the stone, and I became aware of a smell. It was organic and wrong, decay mixed with something else, something wild and predatory and ancient, the kind of smell that triggers something primitive in your brain. That's when I heard it again. Not the clicking, something worse. Breathing. It was loud, rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. I spun around, bringing my rifle to my shoulder. my light following the movement. The beam caught nothing but empty space, but the breathing continued, and now I could hear something else. Movement, something large, moving through the darkness beyond my line of sight. "You need to leave." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls. But it wasn't a voice, it was a sound that approximated speech, like something that had learned to mimic human language without ever fully understanding it. The words were distorted, shaped by a throat designed for something other than language. I didn't run. I don't know why. Panic should have taken over. Fear should have driven me out of that cave. But instead I stood my ground. "What are you?" I demanded. The darkness in front of me seemed to shift. The shape was immense, just at the edge of visibility, too large to be any animal I understood. The breathing became heavier, more agitated. "Leave?" The approximation of speech came again. "Leave now. Don't come back. Don't come here again." "The researcher," I said. "The woman in 2003. Did you kill her?" For a moment there was silence. Then the shape moved forward, and I caught a glimpse of it in the beam of my flashlight. Enough to register that it was vaguely humanoid, impossibly large, covered in dark fur. The eyes were intelligent. Not animal intelligent, but something deeper. Something that understood language and intent and threat. She came to study, to document, to bring others. The words came more clearly this time, the creature's approximation of speech improving as it continued. "I gave her warning. She didn't leave. The mountain took her." "The mountain didn't take her," I said. "You did. You killed her." The shape retreated back into darkness. The breathing came harder now, almost like the creature was struggling with emotion. When it spoke again, the words came in a rush, overlapping in a way that suggested a throat trying to produce speech it wasn't designed for. "I killed nothing. You brought warning. Your kind brought weapons and traps and intention to study and to harm. I am protecting. I am warning. You understand? You see? I did not kill the woman, but I did not save her either. The mountain is hungry. The mountain takes. I only live here. I did not make the rules. I only follow the pattern. I am the guardian of the boundary, and you have crossed it." The creature moved forward again. This time, I saw enough of it to know that my rifle would do nothing. I turned and ran. I ran out of that cave as fast as the narrow passage would allow, my flashlight bouncing, my breath coming in gasps. Behind me, I could hear it pursuing, not running, moving with a strange loping gait that covered distance despite its massive size. The clicking sound returned, loud now, frantic. A sound of frustration or anger or hunger. I burst out of the cave entrance and ran up the canyon. The terrain that I'd carefully navigated down was a blur as I scrambled uphill, my hands and knees scraping on rocks, my rifle forgotten, abandoned at some point when maintaining speed became more important than maintaining weapons. The creature followed, and the clicking grew louder, more frenzied. I scrambled up the canyon wall, using handholds and leverage, not caring about the danger from falling rocks. Behind me, the clicking reached a crescendo, and then, silence. I froze on the canyon wall, bleeding from multiple cuts, lungs burning, and I looked down. The creature stood at the entrance to the cave, watching me with those intelligent eyes. For a moment we stared at each other across the distance. "Don't come back," it said, and the approximation of speech was nearly perfect this time. "Tell no one. Tell no one what you've seen. The mountain will take them if you bring attention. The mountain will take you if you return. You have been warned. Respect the warning." Then it turned and moved back into the cave, disappearing into the darkness. I continued climbing until I reached the canyon rim. I found my way back to the trail through sheer instinct and adrenaline, and I hiked back to my truck in a state of shock that lasted for hours. When I finally sat down in the driver's seat and tried to process what had happened, I realized something crucial. I wasn't certain what I'd seen was real. The creature had been real. The space it occupied had been real. The sound of its movement had been real. The intelligence behind its words had been real. But had I actually seen it clearly? Or had my mind, operating on fear and adrenaline and the expectations that had been building in me for weeks, filled in the details that I couldn't actually perceive? The only thing that was absolutely real was the backpack, the notebook, the specimen vial, the artifacts that proved that the researcher had been real, that her encounter had been real, that something in that canyon had ended her life or her ability to leave. That was what terrified me most. Not the creature, not the encounter, but the realization that I might have just experienced something that I could never prove to anyone, something that existed in the space between reality and obsession. I didn't go to the authorities with what I'd found. I know how that sounds. I found evidence of a researcher who'd been missing for 19 years. I discovered items from her campsite. I located a cave with evidence of large animal activity and an encounter with something that might have been responsible for her disappearance. Any rational person would have immediately reported this to law enforcement, but I also understood, in a way that I still can't fully articulate, that reporting what I'd found would lead to consequences that the creature had warned me about. The mountain will take them if you bring attention. These weren't empty words. This was a statement of consequence, of pattern, of something that had learned to manage human attention over a very long time. So instead, I began investigating privately. I took the backpack and its contents home and locked them in my closet, hidden behind winter equipment and emergency supplies. I continued my ranger duties normally, going through the motions of the job, patrols, documentation, maintenance work, but my actual focus had shifted entirely to understanding what existed in the northern sector of the Alpaca Mountains. I spent hours in the university library in the nearest large city, 2 hours away from Timber Ridge. I researched folklore and cryptozoology, not because I believed in monsters, but because I was trying to find historical records of something matching what I'd encountered. The creature had called itself nothing, had given no indication of what species it was, but there were patterns in the historical record, stories that repeated across different indigenous cultures, tales that spanned centuries. The Wendigo appeared in those stories with remarkable consistency, a creature of the northern forests, an eater of human flesh, a thing that walked upright and was said to be skeletal and impossibly tall, something that could approximate human speech though its voice was always wrong, a hunger that was never satisfied. And, most importantly for what I'd experienced, a creature that was described as being territorial and intelligent, not the mindless monster of popular culture, but something that could think and plan and establish rules for human interaction in its territory. The problem was the folklore contradiction. Wendigos, according to the traditions I read, were created from humans who resorted to cannibalism. They were the result of a curse. They were, in some essential way, a human-made monstrous. That didn't match the age of the phenomenon I was investigating. The records went back to at least 1992, possibly further. The encounter I'd had in the cave suggested something that had lived in that place for decades, possibly longer. The intelligence it had demonstrated suggested learning and cultural development. This wasn't a newly created curse. This was something ancient. I found my answer in a thesis written by an anthropology graduate student in 1998. The thesis was about indigenous knowledge of the Alpaca Mountains region and the stories and warnings that the native peoples had passed down about the northern forests. According to the thesis, there were old stories, very old stories, predating the reservation system and European contact by centuries, of a boundary keeper in the mountains. A creature that lived in the deep places and was responsible for maintaining the separation between the human world and the wilderness. The stories suggested that this creature was not evil, but it was not friendly either. It was a force of nature with its own rules and intentions. The thesis included a quote from an elder from the region. "The boundary keeper does not hunt for evil. It hunts because the wilderness must be protected from those who would take and take without respect. It walks the line between worlds. It speaks the language of humans but thinks in the speech of the earth. To respect the boundary keeper is to survive in the mountains. To ignore it is to be forgotten in the stone." Everything I'd experienced fit this description. The intelligence, the warnings, the protective aspect of its actions, the willingness to let me leave if I respected its authority. The creature in the cave wasn't a Wendigo in the traditional folklore sense. It was something older, something that predated the curse stories. Something that had been protecting its territory long before Europeans came to North America and created their own mythology around the emptiness they felt in the wilderness. This realization changed my understanding of the situation entirely. I wasn't dealing with a rogue predator. I was dealing with something that had established rules, and those rules made sense from a certain perspective. The disappearances, the sightings, the way people were gradually discouraged from visiting the northern sector. It was all part of a system of managing human presence in its territory. The question then became, what did it want from me? The answer came during my fifth encounter, which happened not in the wilderness but at home. It was the middle of December. The snow had come early to the mountains, and the ranger station had shifted to winter protocols. My patrols became less frequent, focusing mainly on the lower passes and maintained roads. The northern sector was officially closed to public access, with warning signs posted at all the trailheads. I went to the station less frequently, doing paperwork from home, and I spent most of my time researching, documenting, trying to understand. The night it appeared at my house, I was reviewing the audio recordings for probably the 100th time. The vocalizations from the 2003 researcher, the clicks and calls and half approximations of human speech layered over the raw animal sounds beneath. I was trying to see if I could identify patterns, if there was communication in those sounds rather than just noise. My dog, a German Shepherd named Copper, who'd lived with me for 6 years, started barking around midnight. Not the casual bark she gave to passing cars, but an alert bark, continuous, intense. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window to check the perimeter, expecting to see a deer or a fox. What I saw instead was a shape standing at the edge of my property, just beyond the range of my floodlights. It was massive, vaguely humanoid. Watching my house, I didn't panic. Somehow I understood that this wasn't a threat, not the kind of immediate threat that would end with violence. This was a message, a decision. The creature had come to me. I grabbed my jacket and walked outside, leaving Copper in the house. The temperature was well below freezing, the cold biting at my exposed skin within seconds. The creature didn't move as I approached. It stood motionless, and I could see the slight vapor of its breath in the cold air. When I was about 15 feet away, it spoke. "You have been studying, learning, searching for understanding." The words came more clearly now, each word distinct, though the voice was still fundamentally wrong. Layered, textured. "This is correct. This is why I allowed you to leave the canyon." "You let me leave," I said. It wasn't a question. I chose not to follow. There is a difference. You came seeking knowledge. You came with respect for the boundary. You were not like the woman before you. You did not come with instruments to measure and study and take. You came to understand. The creature shifted slightly, and I could see more of its form in the starlight. Massive shoulders, arms that reached nearly to the ground, a head that was vaguely shaped like a skull, but wrong-shaped for something other than human dentition and biology. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want the pattern to continue," it said. "For many years your kind came to these mountains seeking beauty, seeking experience, seeking to understand. The relationship was balanced. Your kind respected the wilderness provided. But that has changed. Now your kind comes with cameras and climbing equipment and the desire to conquer. Now your kind comes with greed. The mountain is being wounded. The boundary is failing." It took a step toward me, and I forced myself not to move. "You have seen the pattern. You understand what lives here. You are one of the few humans in your generation who sees the wilderness as something to be in relationship with, not something to be conquered. This is why I did not kill you in the canyon." "What are you asking?" I said. "I am asking for a guardian on your side of the boundary," the creature said. "Someone who understands the rules, someone who can warn your kind, someone who can keep the sensitive places undisturbed. I can force this through fear, but fear fades. I can create disappearances and vocalizations and stories, but some will always try to investigate. Some will always come searching for truth. I need someone who knows the truth and chooses to protect it." I understood what it was asking. I understood the weight of it. "If I agree," I said, "what happens?" "You become a guardian," the creature said. "You understand the boundary. You know what lives here. You prevent others from crossing it. You keep the secret. In exchange, I do not hunt your kind needlessly. The mountain becomes less hungry. The killing stops." "The killing hasn't stopped," I said. "You said it yourself. The pattern continues. People disappear." "Yes," the creature said. "Because the boundary is weakening, because your kind's hunger is growing, because there are fewer and fewer people like you who understand what should be respected. But if you agree, if you become the guardian on your side, then the killing can diminish. The pattern can change. The relationship can heal." I stood in the frozen night, with the being that had caused disappearances and driven people mad and created legends, and I realized that I was going to agree, because the alternative was to report what I'd found, which would lead to investigations, which would lead to hunters and zoologists and government agencies, which would lead to the deaths of dozens of people as they tried to hunt and capture and study the thing standing in front of me. "I agree," I said. "Then hear the rules," the creature said, and its voice took on a deeper timbre. "The northern sector is the boundary. Human access must diminish. No residential areas beyond the ridge. No mining, no logging, no resource extraction. The wilderness in that region is not for human use. Those who come in violation of this will be warned. Those who ignore the warning will be taken. The taking is regrettable but necessary. You will work to prevent the violation. You will redirect human attention to other areas. You will become the reason people avoid the northern sector. Not through fear, but through understanding. How? I asked. You will find ways, the creature said. You are a ranger. You have authority. Use it. And when you cannot prevent violation, you will ensure that those who come are prepared. You will mark the boundary in human terms, in signs and warnings and documented reason. The mountain will mark it in other ways. What about the missing people? I said. The researcher, the hikers. The creature was silent for a long moment. The woman was warned. She chose not to listen. The hikers were not warned, because the boundary was less clear then. Their taking was the consequence of their violation, but it also established the pattern. Fear is a teacher, though it is a crude one. I would prefer understanding. So you want me to make sure understanding happens instead? Yes, the creature said. I want you to teach your kind to respect the boundary before they need to learn fear. If you cannot, then fear will teach them. But that is not my preference. The creature took another step back. You will have dreams. You will know things without learning them. You will sense when the boundary is being approached. This is part of the binding. You cannot refuse it. You cannot unknow it. If you attempt to break this agreement, if you tell others what I am, the mountain will take you. The pattern will shift. But if you keep the agreement, if you protect the boundary, then you will live and the killing will diminish. For how long? I asked. How long do I have to do this? Until the world changes, the creature said. Or until you die. Either way, the burden is yours now. Carry it well. It turned and walked back into the forest, moving with that strange loping gait that covered distance impossibly quickly. Within seconds it had disappeared into the darkness between the trees. I stood there in the freezing night, and I felt the change. It was subtle but unmistakable. Something had shifted in my perception. The boundary of the northern sector, that invisible line between acceptable human presence and protected wilderness, suddenly felt real. Not metaphorically, physically real. I could sense it the way I sensed the direction of true north, or the way my body knew which way was up. It was woven into my consciousness. I was bound to it now. I was guardian of something I hadn't agreed to guard, responsible for something I couldn't refuse, but I understood also that the agreement was necessary. The alternative was horror, was more disappearances, was the slow failure of the boundary as human pressure increased. I was going to spend my life protecting something that most people didn't believe existed. 3 years have passed since the creature came to my house. 3 years of living with knowledge that can't be shared, with a burden that can't be spoken. This is what I'm writing to document, not for publication, but for record, for truth, for the day when, inevitably, someone else discovers what I know and needs to understand the weight of it. The job has consumed me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Being a guardian means becoming hyper-aware of human movement in my territory. It means paying attention to every hiking permit, every backpacking reservation, every small plane that flies over the mountains. It means knowing who wants to come into the northern sector and finding reasons they shouldn't. Most of it is subtle work. I've implemented new regulations, expanded the closure zones during certain seasons, established that the northern ridge is closed to the general public except on specific authorized routes. I've documented the instability of the canyon walls, the danger from falling rocks, the risk of getting lost in the complex waterways. All of it true, all of it accurate, all of it designed to discourage the curious. Some of it is less subtle. There have been 3 people in the past 3 years who've tried to hike into the restricted zones despite the warnings. One was a television crew making a cryptozoology show, convinced that they could document the Wendigo in the Alpaca Mountains. Another was a researcher, drawn by the historical records of disappearances and determined to investigate. The third was a hiker who'd read the stories online and was looking for adventure and proof. I stopped all 3 before they could penetrate far into the boundary. The television crew I handled by reporting safety violations and structural damage to the production company. The researcher I befriended and convinced to expand her focus to other regions. The hiker I forced off the trail with a false report of a dangerous animal in the area. All of them are alive. All of them are safe. None of them reached the canyon. The dreams started immediately after the binding. I see through the eyes of the creature sometimes. I feel what it feels. I sense the vast weight of consciousness that spans the wilderness of the northern sector, distributed through trees and rocks and water in ways I don't fully understand. I experience the hunger that drives it. Not hunger for food, but hunger for respect. for recognition, for the restoration of balance in the relationship between human and wilderness. The dreams are neither nightmare nor pleasant. They simply are, expansive and alien, and utterly real in the way that only dreams can be. I wake from them understanding things about the land that should be impossible to know without hiking every acre. I know where the unstable rock formations are. I know where the predators hunt. I know the patterns of weather and water. I know the boundary as intimately as I know my own house. This knowledge has made me a better ranger in conventional terms. My patrols are more efficient. My documentation is more thorough. I've prevented 3 serious accidents by knowing where hikers were going to fail and rerouting them before the disaster could occur. The park director has commended me for my detailed knowledge of the northern sector, though she doesn't understand how I acquired it. But the knowledge comes with a cost. The creature shows me the violations. When someone enters the restricted zones, I know about it. I feel a pull toward the boundary, like a static charge building in my bones. And if I don't intervene, if I don't stop them before they reach the protected territory, the creature takes action. It's happened twice. The first time was a group of 4 experienced hikers who had the permits and the skills to go deep. I tried to stop them at the trailhead, but they had documentation. They had authorization from the regional office. They had legal right to be there. I couldn't prevent them without confessing that my restrictions weren't based on actual danger, but on something else entirely. They made it to the canyon. I felt it the moment they crossed the true boundary, a sudden clarity, like something I'd been blind to was suddenly visible. I tried to drive up the mountain to intercept them, but the weather had shifted. A freak snow squall had moved in, visibility dropped to near zero, and the roads became impassable. When the snow cleared 6 hours later, there were 3 hikers found wandering on the lower roads, suffering from exposure and disorientation. They had no memory of what happened after they reached Lost Creek. They didn't know where their 4th team member had gone. They were alive but traumatized, convinced that they'd been hiking for only 30 minutes when it had actually been 6 hours. The 4th hiker was never found. I felt his death. I don't know how else to describe it. There was a moment where I was aware of him, aware of his presence in the boundary, and then that awareness simply ceased. It was like someone turning off a light, like an absence where presence had been. I reported it as a missing person. I organized search parties. I played the role of the concerned ranger investigating a tragedy in his territory. And I never told anyone that I knew, with absolute certainty, exactly where his body was, in the cave system below Lost Creek, taken into the mountain by the creature that was supposed to be protecting the boundary. The second violation was an illegal marijuana cultivation operation. The growers had established a small camp deep in the forest, hidden from easy detection. When I discovered it, I knew I had 2 choices: report it to law enforcement and risk the operation being raided, which would require major police presence in the boundary zone, or I could deal with it myself. I chose the third option. I went to the camp at night and burned it. I destroyed the plants, the equipment, the housing. I did it methodically and thoroughly, and I made sure to leave evidence that suggested the fire was accidental. Camp stove explosion, probably. The growers found the site in the morning and reported the loss. They never came back. They were afraid of the mountains now. The boundary had marked them, but I knew that the creature's hand was in it too. I'd felt the pull toward the boundary, felt the pressure building. If I hadn't acted, it would have acted, and the growers would have disappeared rather than just fled. This is the reality of being a guardian. It's negotiation with an ancient and alien intelligence. It's prevention and it's cover-up, and it's the constant realization that you are the only human who knows the truth of what lives in the mountains. Tommy left the ranger service last year. He cited burnout and dissatisfaction with park management, but I know what actually happened. He was asking too many questions. He was still thinking about that kill site we found years ago. He was starting to piece together the pattern in the old incident reports. I saw it happening and I did what I had to do. I steered him away from the records, discouraged his questions, made it clear that further investigation would be unwise. It worked, but it cost me. Tommy had been my friend, and now we don't speak. He thinks I'm part of whatever secret the mountains contain. He's right, but not in the way he imagines. The town has changed in the 3 years I've been guardian. There's been a subtle shift in how people talk about the mountains. The feeling of danger, the sense that the northern sector is a place where things happen, has become cultural. Hikers avoid it. Tourists don't even inquire about access. The wilderness has reclaimed the boundary without my having to do much more than maintain the bureaucratic framework that prevents easy access. The creature is satisfied with this. I feel it in the dreams. The pressure in the boundary has reduced. The anger I sensed from it 3 years ago has become something more like patience. We've established a working relationship, mutually destructive but stable. But stability is fragile in the wilderness. The climate is changing. Snow patterns are shifting. The ecosystem of the Alpaca Mountains is beginning to transform in ways that are subtle but significant. Hiking season is longer each year. The borders of human civilization are creeping into places that were previously too remote or too harsh to access easily. In my dreams, I feel the creature's concern. The boundary is being stressed by forces beyond our control. More people are asking to visit the northern sector. Climate research teams want to establish monitoring stations in locations that the creature considers protected. Mining companies are eyeing the region for mineral extraction. I'm beginning to understand that this isn't a stable long-term solution. Sooner or later, human pressure will overcome all the bureaucratic restrictions and informal discouragement I can construct. Sooner or later, someone with sufficient authority and resources will push through the boundary. The creature knows this, and I can feel, through the binding that connects us, a decision forming. Something about how it will respond when that moment comes. I don't know if I can stop what comes next. I don't know if I should. What I know is that I was chosen for this role because I understand something that most people have forgotten, that wilderness exists for its own sake, not as a resource for human use, that some places should be kept wild, that respect for the boundary is more important than conquest of it. 3 people have disappeared because I failed to keep that boundary secure enough. One creature has killed to maintain its territory, and I am complicit in both. This is the weight of knowing. This is what I carry in the darkness of the northern ridge, where the boundary exists between the human world and the something that watches over the wild places. This is what I will carry until I die, and perhaps beyond. The dreams are becoming more vivid. The pull toward the boundary is becoming stronger, and I'm beginning to understand that my role is not nearly finished. The mountains are calling, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to resist answering. The smell hit me first, not gradually, the way you'd expect. It wasn't like walking into a bad area where decay accumulates, where you prepare yourself mentally. This was instant, sudden, and overwhelming, like something had opened inside my chest and forced air through a filter made of spoiled meat and something else. Something organic that had been rotting in the dark for longer than I could measure. I'm Dakota Whitehorse. That's what my parents named me when I was born on the reservation in northern Wyoming, before I became a uniformed employee of the National Park Service, before I traded my cultural heritage for a steady paycheck and the illusion of stability. Now at 38 years old, after 16 years working these mountains, I can tell you that some names carry weight. Mine reminds me of my grandmother every time someone reads it on my uniform. That burden, that connection to family, to history, to the old stories, would become more relevant than I could have imagined that autumn. October 15th, a Friday. Routine patrol through the northern section of the Alpaca Mountains. The Alpaca Mountains shouldn't be as remote as they are. They're within the park boundary, accessible, theoretically well-traveled. But the northern ranges exist in a strange pocket of reality. No major trails lead there. Hikers avoid them. Rangers cycle through the region. We do our loops, check our GPS points, mark our stations, and leave. The mountains have a way of making you want to leave. Most people don't articulate why, they just do. They follow the patterns, the routes, the timetables that have been in place for decades, and nobody questions it. Nobody suggests new trails through the heart of the northern section. Nobody volunteers for extended stays. I should have listened to that silence, that unspoken understanding among the rangers, but I had paperwork to file, sample collections to make, and equipment to document. My supervisor, a man named Marcus Reeves, who'd been with the service for 23 years but never seemed to actually spend time in the mountains, had assigned me the northern survey route. He was sitting in an air-conditioned office in the valley, and I was the one who had to catalog the terrain. The smell got worse as I moved deeper. My face mask, I wore one because of the dust from the trail, a simple particulate mask, suddenly felt inadequate. The odor seemed to coat the inside of my mouth, to settle in the back of my throat in a way that made swallowing difficult. I stopped the ATV, a 2019 Kawasaki brute force, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. In the mountains you expect sound. Wind through the pines, the creaking of old trees, the occasional animal movement. Water, birds, something. The silence in the northern Alpaca Mountains on that afternoon wasn't an absence of sound. It was presence. It was thickness. It wrapped around me like a physical thing, and I became hyper-aware of my own breathing, the rustling of my jacket, the slight creak of the ATV seat as my weight shifted. I've been in these mountains hundreds of times. I've handled wildlife encounters. I've navigated harsh weather, difficult terrain, and the kind of physical exhaustion that makes you question your career choices. I have training. I have experience. I have rational frameworks for understanding the world around me. What I didn't have, what nothing could have prepared me for, was the sensation of being watched by something that watches the way a hunting animal watches, without curiosity, without hesitation, with the singular purpose of assessment and consumption. I felt it before I processed it, the weight of attention on the back of my neck, the crawling sensation at the base of my skull that every primate carries as an evolutionary inheritance, a warning system for when a predator has acquired your scent. Turning, I saw nothing but the tree line, dense, dark. The afternoon light was filtering through at a low angle, creating shadow patterns that confused depth perception. I could be looking at something 50 feet away or 200 feet away. The mountains have that effect on you. "Hello?" I called out. Stupid, absolutely stupid. But the silence was pressing too hard. The smell intensified. My training kicked in. I checked my GPS coordinates, 44.7863 degrees N, 109.8942 degrees W. I noted the time, 3:47 p.m. I was approximately 8.3 miles from the Northern Ranger Station, 12 miles from the base camp. My radio had adequate signal. I checked that. 2/3 of my fuel remained. My supplies were stable. Everything was within normal parameters. Everything except the wrongness. I'd read the incident reports. Every ranger in the region had. They weren't official, at least not in any formal sense. They were notes in the margins, informal complaints filed to management about strange sounds, odd animal behavior, missing equipment, and in exactly 3 documented cases over the past decade, missing hikers who were later found, often at significant distances from where they'd disappeared, with no clear explanation for how they'd relocated themselves. The most recent case was Marcus Whitmore, a hiker from Montana who'd gone missing in the northern section in July of 2019. His body was found 6 weeks later, 8 miles from where he was last seen on the trail, at an elevation nearly 2,000 feet higher than where he'd started. The coroner in Billings reported severe dehydration, signs of prolonged exertion, and what was officially classified as wounds consistent with predation by large carnivore, possibly grizzly bear, though the pattern was atypical. Nobody wanted to press the detail. The report was filed. The family was notified. Life continued. But I'd talked to the ranger who found Whitmore. His name was Colin Pierce, and he quit 2 weeks later. Said he was changing careers, moved to California. He didn't say what he'd seen in those detail assessments, but his hands shook when he had a cup of coffee in the ranger station the day before he left, and he didn't make eye contact with anyone who'd worked the northern routes. I was standing on that same mountain, in that same section, breathing air that smelled like necrotic tissue, and something worse, something that made my stomach clench in a way that transcended disgust and entered pure, primitive revulsion. I started the ATV. I didn't run the engine. I just sat there with the key turned to accessory mode, trying to decide what the rational choice was. Document the smell, report it, continue on my route as assigned, turn back. The rational choice would have been to turn back. I'd done my job. I'd identified an anomaly. I could file a report, request a follow-up investigation, let someone else with less experience shoulder the burden of exploring it. But I was 16 years in, and the job had worn away my better instincts. I'd learned to operate in the mountains the way you learn to operate anywhere, through repetition, through the gradual erosion of caution. I knew these mountains in a way that made me believe I had some kind of immunity to their strangeness. I was wrong about that. I started the engine. The sound in that silence was obscene. The ATV's motor, normally a familiar working sound, became somehow intrusive. It broke whatever spell the mountains had woven, and I used that moment of disruption to accelerate forward, moving deeper into the northern section along the barely maintained survey route. The smell faded marginally, enough that I could breathe with less instinctive gagging. The trees opened up slightly. We were moving through a transition zone between dense forest and subalpine meadow. My GPS showed the elevation increasing: 9,400 feet, 9,600 feet, 9,800 feet. The air was getting thinner, colder. My breath began to cloud slightly in front of my face, even though it was mid-October and we weren't supposed to get freezing temperatures at this elevation for another few weeks. It was cold, not atmospheric cold, real cold. The kind of cold that makes you aware of your mortality, the kind of cold that begins to seep into the spaces between your cells if you stay exposed long enough. I should have turned back. Instead, I drove another mile, then 2 miles. The survey route merged with what might have been an old animal trail, or might have been something that just happened to run parallel to where humans had walked. There was something about following a path that suggested intention, that made my mind create a narrative of safety. If something had walked here, others must have walked here. If it was passable for them, it was passable for me. The path led up, always up, into the mountains, toward the highest section of the northern range. My GPS marked the elevation at 10,100 feet when I finally saw it. The clearing wasn't natural. I knew that immediately. The shape of it, perfectly circular, roughly 40 feet in diameter, didn't occur in nature with that kind of geometric precision. Everything inside the clearing was gone. Not dead, not dried out, gone. Bare soil, almost white in color, like something had bleached it or had been feeding on the mineral content so aggressively that even the bacteria had abandoned the space. Around the perimeter of the clearing, arranged in a pattern that suggested intention, were bones. I stopped the ATV maybe 30 feet from the nearest bone and killed the engine. The silence came back immediately and it seemed satisfied, like it had been waiting for me to stop making noise. There were dozens of bones, maybe hundreds, scattered in a way that suggested they'd been there for months, perhaps longer. Some were large. I saw what looked like elk femurs, maybe moose. Some were small, rabbit-sized, bird bones, but others were medium-sized, canine-structured, and some of the configurations were wrong, asymmetrical, angled in ways that suggested bodies that didn't match standard mammalian architecture. The smell rose again, not from the bones themselves. The cold would have preserved them, and there wasn't visible decay. The smell came from the clearing itself, from the earth. The soil was breathing, somehow. That's how it felt, like the ground was exhaling something that had been trapped deep inside. I got off the ATV. I don't remember deciding to. My body seemed to be operating on some autopilot function, some older programming that overrode my conscious decision-making. I walked to the edge of the clearing. The bones nearest to me were elk, that much was clear. The massive pelvis, the long femurs. But they were twisted. The joints showed signs of having been bent backward, in ways that would have been impossible while the animal was alive, and the breaks in the bone weren't clean. They were splintered, crushed, as though the breaking had been done violently and repeatedly. I photographed everything. My phone came out of my pocket. I still don't remember consciously reaching for it, and I documented the clearing, the bones, the strange bleached soil. I took 23 photos. Behind me, the ATV suddenly honked, not a manufactured honk, a pressure-sensitive honk, as if something substantial had leaned against the seat with enough weight to compress it and trigger the alarm. I spun, my hand instinctively going to the bare mace on my belt, but there was nothing there. The ATV sat empty in the late afternoon light, completely undisturbed except for the slight depression in the seat that might have been my imagination. I didn't feel safe anymore. The safety I'd imagined, the product of authority and uniform and routine, evaporated in that moment. What I felt was isolation. Absolute, complete, existential isolation. I was standing on a mountainside, miles from help, surrounded by evidence that something large and predatory had been feeding in this location, possibly for years, and that thing knew I was there. The smell changed. It became sharper, more acrid, like something alive had just voided its bowels in fear or aggression. The wind had shifted, coming down the mountain toward me instead of away from me. I ran. There's no strategic analysis to running. It's purely evolutionary. Your brain recognizes threat, and your legs respond. That's what happened. I ran back to the ATV, got the engine started, and drove away from that clearing as fast as the terrain would allow. The survey route that had seemed so manageable on the way up became a maze of obstacles. Trees seemed to lean in from the sides, the path twisted back on itself. I was hyperventilating, my vision starting to tunnel from the adrenaline and the altitude. But I made it back to the main road. I made it back to the ranger station. I drove the ATV straight in and shut off the engine with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely grip the key. My colleague, a ranger named Derek Hastings, who'd been working the valley section, was inside doing paperwork. He took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I almost told him. My mouth opened. I prepared to explain what I'd seen. But then I remembered something I'd learned in 16 years of this job. Rangers don't talk about the mountains. Not really, not the strange things. There's an unspoken agreement, a tacit understanding that certain experiences are yours to carry alone. Nothing, I said, just a long day. Derek accepted that. Of course he did. That's how we all operate. But that night, sitting in my small ranger's quarters at the base camp, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. All 23 of them. They were clear, detailed, damning in their documentation of something that shouldn't exist. By the morning, I'd deleted them. That might have been the end of it. That might have been the story of a ranger who saw something unsettling, processed it as a natural phenomenon, a predator's kill site perhaps, something explainable, and moved on with his life. Plenty of rangers have those stories. We don't speak about them, but we have them, except I couldn't sleep that night. And the next morning, when I checked the supply logs, I found that food from the ranger station's pantry, specifically all the preserved meats, all the protein, had been taken. The supply room showed no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no disturbance. It was as if whatever came had a key, or understood how locks worked. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to end. Not easily, not with silence. Something in the northern Alpaca Mountains had taken notice of me. And in the hierarchy of that place, I wasn't the predator. The next week was operational hell. Marcus Reeves demanded I complete the survey route despite my request for reassignment. I couldn't tell him why I wanted reassignment without explaining about the clearing, about the bones, about the feeling that something had learned my smell and was filing it away in whatever passed for memory in its predatory architecture. So I went back. I returned to the clearing on October 22nd, exactly a week after my first encounter. I told myself it was prudent. I told myself that if I documented the location carefully enough, recorded the coordinates precisely enough, I could hand it off to someone else, sell it as a wildlife concern, have Derek take over the follow-up, escape the northern section with my psychological integrity intact. I was lying to myself even then. The clearing looked different in daylight. Full daylight, mid-morning light. The bones were still there, arranged in their terrible configuration, but they seemed almost innocent in the brightness. Bones are just bones. They're objects. They don't carry the weight of predation in full sunlight the way they do in shadow and fading day. Except these bones had moved. I'm certain of this. I'm certain because I have a specific memory of the largest elk skeleton being positioned near the southern edge of the clearing. I have a visual memory of it, sharp and clear. Now it was positioned at the center, the bones arranged around it in a tighter circle, creating something that resembled a nest. And there were new bones, smaller ones. Things I didn't recognize. Things that looked almost mammalian but with articulation patterns that were wrong. These were clustered at the center, around the repositioned elk. Someone had been here. Something had been here. I documented the changes, took new photographs. I deleted them again that night, and moved through the clearing in a methodical pattern, cataloging what I could identify. The elk had been partially consumed, the long bones cracked open, the marrow presumably extracted. The smaller, unidentifiable bones were scattered in what appeared to be feeding patterns. This was an active site. This was somewhere that something regularly used. As I moved through the clearing, I began to notice other things. Scratch marks on several of the large trees at the perimeter. Not fresh. These were old, maybe weeks old, the exposed wood beginning to oxidize and darken, but they were high, roughly 8 to 9 feet up the trunk. Whatever had made them had been tall, very tall, and the spacing between the claw marks, because that's what they were clearly, was too wide. A grizzly bear's claw span maxes out at around 5 inches. These marks had spacing of nearly 12 inches between the outer claws. Nothing in the scientific literature of North American apex predators had claw spans that large. I was methodically documenting these marks, photographing them with my phone camera, and deleting them later. When Derek found me, I didn't hear him arrive. That should have frightened me. I was already hyper-alert, my adrenaline systems primed for danger. But instead, when he emerged from the trees on his own ATV, I felt almost relieved. Another person, proof that the outside world still existed. Proof that I wasn't completely isolated in whatever nightmare the mountains had become. "Hey," he called out, turning off his engine. "Marcus wondered what was taking you so long on the survey. Sent me up to check on you." Derek Hastings was a good ranger, competent. He'd worked these mountains for 8 years. He was younger than me by 5 years, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from not yet understanding how much horror can hide in routine places. "Got interested in some wildlife patterns," I said, gesturing to the clearing. "Looks like a predator site. Want to help me document it?" He approached, and I watched his face as he registered what he was seeing. The fear took about 3 seconds to manifest. It started as confusion, his brain trying to categorize what he was looking at, and then the confusion deepened into something else. His jaw tightened. His hand went instinctively to his radio, though he didn't key it. "What is this?" he asked. "Kill site," I said. "Large predator. Multiple prey animals. Those claw marks," he said, pointing at the tree I'd been examining. "Yeah," I said. "I know." He looked at me, and there was something in his expression that felt like an accusation, like I should have warned him, like I should have prevented him from having to see this. "We need to report this," he said. And there was the trap, the moment of decision that had been waiting for me. If I reported it, then the park would send investigators, wildlife specialists, people who would document, photograph, and attempt to explain. They would take the evidence and try to fit it into frameworks that made sense, but it didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense, and bringing in outside expertise would only expose that lack of sense. It would create a mess, it would put more people at risk, and it would inevitably lead back to me, the ranger who found it, the ranger who'd been assigned to this route, the ranger who'd been warned by 16 years of unspoken mountain knowledge to avoid this place. "Let me document it first," I said. "Get comprehensive photos, make sure we're not missing anything, then we file the report." Derek nodded, but he wasn't comfortable. He kept his distance from the clearing's perimeter, refusing to walk through the bone field. He stayed on his ATV, keeping his eyes on the trees. "There's something else," I said. "Come with me." I led him to the western side of the clearing, where the scratches on the trees were deepest. I showed him the claw marks, the height, the spacing. "That's not possible," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." We stood there for a long moment, both of us trying to create a narrative that could encompass what we were seeing. A very large bear, a mountain lion with an unusual claw structure, some kind of exotic animal escaped from captivity. We ran through the rational options, and every single one of them failed to fit the evidence. "I want to leave," Derek said. "I don't like this place." "Yeah," I said. "Okay." We rode back down the mountain together, but the relief of having a companion was short-lived. By the time we reached the ranger station, Derek had changed his decision. "I'm not reporting this," he said. I didn't ask him why. I understood. There were certain truths about the mountains that, once accepted, demanded change. People couldn't continue their normal routines, their normal patrols, their normal lives, knowing what waited in the northern section. The only way to survive psychologically was to pretend not to know, to file it away with all the other unspoken knowledge that rangers carried silently. "Okay," I said. Derek never went back to the northern section. He requested the valley assignment permanently, and Marcus approved it without comment. Apparently, Derek wasn't the only ranger to request reassignment from the northern routes. There was a pattern. The mountain had been quietly expelling people for years, but I was stuck. My expertise, my tenure, my documentation, all of it had made me into the de facto expert on the northern section. I couldn't request reassignment without drawing attention, so I continued the patrols. I continued moving through the mountains with the knowledge that something large and predatory was aware of my presence, and it was learning about me. On October 28th, I found equipment missing from the ranger station. My rain jacket, my headlamp, a water canteen. Small things, individually insignificant. But the manner of their disappearance was what mattered. They were taken from my personal locker, which was locked. There were no signs of forced entry. Either someone had the key, or they understood mechanics well enough to manipulate the lock mechanism. On November 2nd, I found scat in the station itself. Not in the building, that would have been impossible, but in the access tunnel that ran beneath the building, connecting the main station to the storage facility. The feces were large, dark, and contained material that looked like strips of fabric. My jacket, my headlamp's rubber grip, it was tracking me, it was learning about me. It was testing boundaries. I began to see patterns in the mountains that I'd never noticed before. Or perhaps I was now noticing patterns that had always existed and my previous ignorance had simply been a form of protective blindness. Every third or fourth day I'd find traces of its presence, massive footprints in the soft soil near the survey routes, each print showing 6 digits instead of the normal 4 or 5 that North American fauna displayed. Deep gouges on trees where something had marked territory or climbed. Once, in early November, I found a pile of pine cone husks and pine cones that had been stripped of their seeds with surgical precision, gathered into a careful mound that required intelligence, that required intention, that required something more than simple predator behavior. The hikers stopped coming to the northern section entirely. It wasn't an official closure. There had been no mandate from park administration. It was something else, an intuitive understanding that had spread through the hiking community. Guidebooks were updated to recommend alternate trails. Reviews on hiking forums began to mention strange atmosphere and unsettling feelings. One post on an outdoor recreation site described an overwhelming sense of being hunted in the northern Alpaca Mountains, and it had been shared and discussed hundreds of times before the thread was removed. The mountains were advertising their danger, not with signs or warnings, but with something deeper. With the accumulated dread of dozens of people who'd wandered into that section and come out changed. By mid-November, I was the only ranger regularly entering the northern section. Derek had formalized his move. The other rangers assigned to broader coverage areas had found excuses to avoid the deeper routes. Marcus, sitting in his office in the valley, seemed not to notice. Or perhaps he chose not to notice. Perhaps the mountain's influence extended even to administrative functions. I began a practice I've never admitted to anyone. On nights when I wasn't on patrol, I would monitor the ranger station's security system, ostensibly to check for break-ins or wildlife damage, but actually to track the creature. The station had 3 external cameras, basic equipment, nothing sophisticated, just motion-activated lights with video recording. What I found over the course of 3 weeks was a pattern of visits. The creature approached from different angles, never the same route twice, but it was coming to the station multiple times per week. The footage was dark, the motion-activated lighting inadequate, but I could make out a shape. Large, Bible, impossibly tall, moving with an unusual gait that suggested a structure more human than animal. In one piece of footage from November 9th, it stood at the window of my residential quarters for approximately 43 seconds. The image was grainy, obscured by the reflection of the infrared light, but I could see what I convinced myself was a face. Flat, wide, with a mouth that opened as it looked through the window. That was the night I decided to leave. Not physically. I couldn't leave without explaining why. An explanation would create problems. But mentally, psychologically, emotionally, I began to make preparations that, had anyone been watching, would have been indistinguishable from preparations for a long ranger tour. I packed supplies. I created detailed notes about my assignments. I arranged my affairs. I was preparing to disappear. The creature, with its inhuman intelligence, seemed to sense this. In the final week of November, it escalated its contact. It left things outside the station. A piece of my uniform, a ranger service patch that had been sewn onto my summer jacket, an animal fetus, partially preserved, positioned on the doorstep. My headlamp, now inoperative, placed on the hood of my personal vehicle. These weren't random harassment. This was communication. This was something saying, I know who you are, I know what you smell like, I know where you live, I know everything about you, and I have a choice about what happens next. Winter in the Alpaca Mountains comes early. By early December, snow had permanently covered the higher elevations, and the survey routes became impassable without specialized equipment. Marcus issued a notice that the northern section would be closed to patrols until spring. Wildlife activity, the notice said, increased predator presence during winter denning season. But that wasn't why we were closing the northern section. We all knew it, though no one spoke about it. We were closing it because something in those mountains had claimed that territory, and it was expressing ownership in ways that went beyond animal behavior into something more deliberate, more calculated. My reassignment came through on December 4th. I was moved to the visitor center in the valley, effectively removed from field operations. The excuse was administrative. There had been personnel restructuring, and they needed an experienced ranger for public-facing work. The truth was less explicit but more apparent. Marcus was removing me from the field without the complication of asking me to resign. I should have been relieved. I should have left the mountains behind, started a normal routine at the visitor center, been grateful for the extraction from danger. I took the assignment. I moved my belongings from the ranger station to a small apartment in the town adjacent to the park. I began the process of acting normal, but I couldn't let it go. The drive back to the mountains consumed me. At night, I would review the security footage I'd recorded. I would look at the GPS coordinates of the clearing, the trail markers, the animal traces. I would lie in bed and try to construct a taxonomy for something that didn't fit into any existing framework. I would read research papers on animal behavior, predation patterns, bipedal locomotion in mammals, and none of it would fit. Then one night in mid-December, about 2 weeks into my visitor center assignment, I found a box on my apartment doorstep. There was no return address. It was a simple cardboard container, maybe 2 feet long, half a foot wide, sealed with packing tape. Inside was a leather journal, old, worn, the cover cracked with age, and a photograph. The photograph showed a ranger standing in front of the Alpaca Mountains. His uniform was from the 1980s, the style and patches making that clear. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, standing with the kind of confidence that came from someone who believed they understood their environment. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, Colin Pierce, 1987. But that wasn't possible. Colin Pierce had worked at the ranger station in 2019. He was 40-something, not a young man from the 1980s. He'd quit after finding Marcus Whitmore's body. He'd moved to California, unless that photo was from an ancestor. Unless it was from someone with the same name, taken decades ago, preserved across generations. Unless the mountains had been trying to communicate something through layers of time. The journal was written in a hand that changed over its pages, becoming increasingly erratic, increasingly frantic. The first entry was dated August 15, 1987, aligned to Northern Section Patrol starting tomorrow. Parker says it's routine work, wildlife surveys, trail maintenance, border checks, says I'll be bored most days, says the mountains are beautiful if you appreciate that sort of thing. I don't know what he means about appreciating them. They're just mountains. I'm just a ranger. This is just a job. The last entry was dated November 8, 1987. It knows what I am and where I am and what I want and what I fear. How does it know these things? How can it comprehend human emotion well enough to weaponize it? I came to the clearing again today. The bones are arranged in patterns now, like writing, like language, like it's trying to communicate. I think I understand what it wants. I think it wants me to stay. The journal was written across nearly 80 pages. I read it over 2 nights, sitting in my apartment with all the doors and windows locked, my phone charged next to me, telling myself that I could call for help at any moment. What I read was the account of a young ranger slowly losing coherence as he encountered something in the northern Alpaca Mountains that defied his ability to process it rationally. The early entries were measured, observational. They described traces, patterns, unusual animal behavior. By mid-October, they became frantic. References to the clearing appeared, references to bones arranged with intention, references to being watched by something that understands thinking. By November, the entries became fractured, sometimes consisting of single sentences written in the margins. It came to the station. It came inside. It walked through the walls. The smell means it's close. The smell means it knows what I'm thinking. I saw its face. It has too many joints in its neck. It can turn its head all the way around while still facing forward. It's learning everything about me. Every time I think, I can feel it in my mind. Not reading my thoughts, recognizing them, like my thoughts are a pattern it's learned to predict. And then after that, nothing. The journal ended. There was no final entry, no resolution, no explanation of what happened to Colin Pierce in November 1987. I spent 3 weeks trying to verify the information. I contacted the park archives. I requested old personnel records. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests. The responses, when they came, were sparse. There was no Colin Pierce on the roster for the Alpaca Mountains Ranger Station in 1987. The personnel files from that era had incomplete records due to filing transitions in 1993, according to the response. But I found his name in a newspaper archive. A brief mention in the Billings Gazette from November 15, 1987, Park Ranger missing. A ranger assigned to the Alpaca Mountains National Park section has been reported missing by colleagues. Search efforts are ongoing. Park administration is asking for any information from hikers or visitors who may have encountered Ranger Colin Pierce, and then nothing. No follow-up, no resolution, no conclusion to the story, unless the conclusion was that Colin Pierce became part of the mountain, unless he was still there, in some form part of the creature's collection of bones and flesh and meaning in that clearing. I took the journal and the photograph to Marcus Reeves. I sat in his office, a neat, orderly space with awards on the walls and a view of the valley, and I laid out what I'd found. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he got up, walked to his file cabinet, and removed a folder. He placed it on the desk between us. Inside were files, incident reports, personnel records, all of them related to the northern section, all of them going back decades. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Since 1994, Marcus said. "That's when I transferred to this district. One of the rangers in the valley told me to never assign anyone to the northern section long term, to rotate people through, keep assignments short, and quietly transfer anyone who wanted to spend extended time there. He said there had been problems in the past." "Problems?" I repeated. "People disappearing," Marcus said. "People changing. Rangers with psychological breaks. Hikers who came out of the northern section with trauma they couldn't explain. All of it deniable. All of it explicable as occupational stress or animal encounters or simple human failure." "And you've done nothing," I said. "What would you have me do?" Marcus's voice was calm, almost clinical. "Report to park administration that something impossible exists in our territory, that something intelligent and dangerous and older than the park itself is living in our mountains? Do you understand what would happen? The park would be closed, the economy of the region would collapse, panic would spread, and the thing itself, whatever it is, would simply become more dangerous. It would expand its territory. It would escalate its predation. So instead you just keep feeding it rangers," I said. "You just keep assigning people to short tours and hoping they come out unchanged." "I keep the mountain contained," Marcus said. "The rangers who work the northern section are warned, in subtle ways. They're given assignments that keep them from establishing patterns the creature could predict. And most of them learn, eventually, to avoid the deeper areas. Most of them survive." He said most. The implication was clear. "How many haven't?" I asked. Marcus didn't answer. He just opened the folder and showed me the documents. Missing persons reports, incident summaries, death certificates listing causes that ranged from bear attack to hypothermia to accident cause undetermined. 7 rangers. Going back to 1956, 7 rangers assigned to the northern Alpaca Mountains who hadn't come out the way they went in. "The creature's been here longer than the park," Marcus said. "The indigenous peoples knew about it. There are stories in the reservation archives, tales about a shape changer that lived in the mountains that fed on animals and sometimes on people. They called it different names depending on the language, but the description was consistent. A tall thing, bipedal, intelligent, predatory in a way that goes beyond hunger." "Wendigo?" I said. It wasn't a question. "The local tribes called it different things," Marcus said. "But yes, roughly translated to the concept. A thing that consumes, a thing that hungers, a thing that understands hunger in ways other predators don't." I left his office with the journal, the photograph, and no resolution. Marcus made me promise not to speak about any of this, not to file reports, not to go to park administration. He assured me that if I did, the problem would escalate in ways that would be far worse for the park, for the region, and for myself. I didn't question whether he was right. Somewhere deep in my evolutionary programming, some ancient instinct told me he was. Over the next month, I became obsessed with documenting what I could find. I compiled information on every missing or dead ranger. I researched the indigenous history. I read every account I could find of the creature. And there were accounts scattered across old diaries, reservation records, obscure folklore documentation. They all described the same thing: a predator, a hunter, something that existed in the liminal spaces between the human world and the wild world, and something that, according to one historical account from 1901, learned to mimic the appearance of men, leading hunters deeper into the mountains to remove them from the world of other humans. That was when I began to understand what was happening to me. The creature hadn't killed me. It hadn't torn me apart or consumed me or left me in a clearing full of bones. Instead, it was keeping me alive. It was learning me. It was constructing a model of who I was, how I thought, what motivated me. It was using the very human communication I was attempting to make, my documentation, my investigation, my attempts to understand, as a way of understanding me. And then one night in late December, I found something new on my apartment doorstep. Another box, another piece of communication. Inside was a photograph I'd never taken and could never have possessed. It was a photo of me, inside the clearing, standing at the center, surrounded by bones. The angle suggested it had been taken from above, from someone tall, standing behind me. My expression in the photograph was serene, peaceful, like I'd finally found something I'd been searching for my entire life. But I'd never been back to the clearing. Not since November. I had 6 days to decide. I knew this because the creature told me, not in words but through the patterns of its visits, the escalation of its contact, the way it had begun to walk the line between the world I inhabited and the mountains where it lived. The signs started appearing in the first week of January. A photograph of my apartment building, left on my car windshield, the address of my workplace at the visitor center, written in a hand that wasn't mine, on a note placed on my door. A security camera image from the visitor center, captured and printed and delivered to my mailbox, showing me standing at the reception desk, with a shadow on the wall behind me that was shaped like something tall and impossibly jointed. Each communication was saying the same thing: I can reach you anywhere. I can find you in the city, in the crowds, in the places you believe are safe. The only difference between the mountains and here is proximity. Out there, I'm clearly defined. In here, I'm already in your space, learning you, becoming you. Come back to the mountains. Come back where the distinction between predator and prey becomes clear. Come back to the clearing. On January 12th, I requested leave from the visitor center. Stress, I said. Family concerns. My supervisor approved it without hesitation. Everyone had begun to understand that something was wrong with me, even if no one wanted to articulate exactly what. I made preparations methodically. I left notes that seemed to address normal concerns. I updated my will. I paid bills in advance. I left contact information for family scattered around my apartment, as if I might be disappearing, and wanted to make sure someone would notice eventually. Then I loaded the ATV with supplies and drove back to the mountains. The ranger station was quiet when I arrived. I wasn't expected, and for that I was grateful. I avoided contact with the skeleton crew maintaining the winter operations. I moved through the administrative areas efficiently, grabbed equipment from the storage room, proper gear for winter in the mountains, gear that suggested I was planning an extended stay, and headed toward the northern section. The snow was deep, but the ATV handled it well. I was physically prepared. My training was sharp, but I was moving towards something that no amount of training could prepare you for, and I knew it. The trail to the clearing was invisible under the snow. I navigated from memory, from the GPS coordinates burned into my mind, from the gravitational pull of something I could feel but not quantify. The mountains were different in winter. The silence was deeper, the isolation more profound, but also the presence of the thing was more obvious. Like it was closer to the surface, its attention less diffuse, more concentrated. I reached the clearing at dusk. The snow had partially filled it, creating a new landscape over the bones. But something had been moving here frequently. There were deep tracks crossing the clearing in multiple directions, trails that suggested habitation. In one corner of the clearing, the snow had been melted or swept away, revealing the bare earth underneath, and on that earth, new bones were arranged. Human bones. Recent. The articulation suggested a body that had been carefully disassembled rather than scattered by feeding behavior. There was a precision to the arrangement that was undeniably intentional. I stepped off the ATV and walked toward the center of the clearing. As I walked, I understood with absolute clarity what was happening. This was a test. This was the final measurement of whether I could be integrated into something larger than myself. The creature didn't want to kill me the way it killed the animals. It wanted to understand me. It wanted to know whether I could accept what I was seeing, accept what it was, accept the boundaries of the world I'd previously believed in, and still choose to be present in the space where it existed. In the center of the clearing, I sat down in the snow. The light was fading fast and the temperature was dropping. The wind, coming down from the highest peaks, carried the smell with it, that necrotically sweet odor that I'd come to recognize as the creature's signature. It was close, very close, perhaps only a few hundred feet away, watching from the tree line the way it had learned to watch humans. I thought about Marcus Reeves sitting in his office, managing the problem by allowing it to continue. I thought about Derek Hastings requesting reassignment because he understood that some knowledge can't be unlearned. I thought about Colin Pierce, whose journal had become my map to understanding what was happening. I thought about the 7 rangers before him, going back through decades, all of them walking a path that had been prepared for them by something that had learned to anticipate human behavior. And I understood what the creature had been waiting for. It wasn't waiting for bodies. It had plenty of those. What it had been waiting for was willing participation. It had been waiting for someone to walk into the clearing voluntarily, to sit at its center, to accept the reality of its existence and choose not to flee. It was waiting for surrender, for acknowledgement, for recognition. As darkness fell completely, I heard movement in the trees, large, slow, deliberately heavy, like something wanted to be heard. The branches cracked as the creature moved toward the clearing's edge, stopping just beyond the perimeter, at the line where snow met shadow. I could see it, though not clearly. A profile, tall, its neck too long, its head set at an angle that no human neck could achieve. Its breathing was slow and deep, and with each breath I could smell it more intensely. It was a smell I'd come to know over the months, and now, in proximity, it was overwhelming. It wasn't decay or corruption exactly. It was something else. The smell of deep winter, of hibernation, of spaces beneath the earth that hadn't seen light in geological time. It stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat in the snow, waiting for whatever would happen next. And then it did something unexpected. It made a sound, not a roar or a howl, but something closer to human speech. A low growl that modulated into something resembling syllables. It was trying to speak, trying to communicate in a language that approximated human vocalization, but filtered through a throat that wasn't built for human speech. The sound resolved into something I almost understood. A name, my name, not Dakota, but something deeper. Something that seemed to encompass not just who I was, but what I was. My role as observer, as recorder, as someone caught between two worlds. I stood up. The creature didn't move. It just watched as I walked toward the tree line, toward the darkness where it waited. My legs moved of their own accord, but I wasn't afraid. I'd passed beyond fear at some point during this journey, moved into a space of acceptance and understanding that I can't adequately articulate. I reached the edge of the clearing. The creature stepped forward, and I could see it more clearly now. It was taller than I'd imagined, probably 8 feet, maybe more. Its face was flattened, its eyes positioned more to the sides of its head than in front, giving it a field of vision more like a prey animal than a predator, which somehow made it more horrifying. Those eyes, they were intelligent, they contained understanding. It reached out one of its arms, appendages that were more like limbs, with too many joints, bending in ways that seemed to defy skeletal structure. When it touched me, its skin was cold and textured like bark. I remember thinking that I should document this. I should write this down, preserve this moment, share it with the world. But I also understood that this was a moment that didn't translate into the world. This was something that existed only here, in the mountains, in the space between the human realm and something older. The creature made that sound again, the modulated growl that seemed like speech. It was pulling me into the darkness beneath the trees, and I went. The last thing I remember clearly is the smell becoming stronger, more complex. I could distinguish individual notes in it, the decay of winter, the hibernation of the earth, something ancient and hungry and very, very patient. And then the snow gave way to stone, to caves that descended beneath the mountains. What happened in those caves I can't properly describe, not because I don't remember. I remember everything with perfect clarity, but because the experience doesn't translate into the language of normal human experience. I was shown things, not visually, but in a way that was more like direct knowledge transfer. Understanding was placed in my mind about what the creature was, how it thought, what it wanted. It wasn't a Wendigo in the literal sense. That was just a name, a folk categorization for something that existed outside categorical thinking. It was a remnant of something older than human civilization, something that had been in these mountains before the continents finished their geological shifting. It was a predator, yes, but not in the way I'd understood predation. It didn't kill for nourishment, it killed to understand. It consumed because understanding required consumption, the processing of other consciousness through its own metabolism, and it had been trying to understand humans for centuries. I was shown the clearing, but not as I'd understood it. The bones weren't just evidence of feeding, they were a record, a library. The creature knew the structure of every animal that had entered its territory, and the human bones, 7 of them, arrayed in specific positions, represented something different. Not failures, but successes. Rangers who had completed the process, who had come to understanding. The creature showed me where they were now. Not dead exactly. Not alive in a conventional sense. They existed in a space adjacent to normal consciousness, integrated somehow into the creature's perception. They were models. templates, ways of thinking that had been absorbed and were now part of what the creature understood about human psychology. And it wanted me to be the eighth. I could feel the offer, the choice. I could remain myself, but integrated. I could maintain my consciousness, my identity, my memory, but in a framework that also included 7 other human perspectives, 7 other ways of thinking that had been processed and integrated into something larger than any individual consciousness. I could become part of the mountain, part of the creature, part of something that existed between states, between categories, between the human and the wild. And I chose yes. Dakota Whitehorse submitted his resignation from the National Park Service on January 28, 2019. The letter was brief. It cited personal reasons and made no mention of the mountains, the creature, or anything unusual about his tenure. His supervisor accepted the resignation without complication. What followed was a period of approximately 2 weeks during which Dakota's apartment was found empty. His personal possessions were gone. His vehicle was left in the parking lot. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of trauma. It appeared that he had simply packed his things and left. The park filed a missing person report, which was processed and filed but generated no investigation. Missing people in the region were not uncommon, and in this case there was no indication of foul play. The case was closed within 48 hours. Derek Hastings heard about the disappearance and made a specific request to Marcus Reeves that he be given access to the security footage from the ranger station. Marcus denied the request. Derek pressed the matter. After a conversation, the details of which remain undocumented, Derek withdrew the request and never spoke about it again. He transferred to a ranger station in a different region the following month. The northern Alpaca Mountains remained closed during the winter season and were reopened in late March when the snow cleared. New rangers were assigned to the routine patrols, rotated every few months, kept on short assignment cycles. The pattern continued. The unspoken agreement held. But things had changed. The hikers reported a different quality to their unease. Instead of terror, there was now something more complex. A presence that was less aggressive, more curious. Some hikers reported hearing sounds that were almost like language. Others mentioned encountering areas of the mountains that seemed welcoming, almost inviting. And there were the photographs. Beginning in February 2019, photographs started appearing on hiking forums. Images supposedly taken by visitors to the northern Alpaca Mountains. The pictures showed landscapes, the clearing in spring, the forest in summer light, the mountains from various perspectives. All of them were exceptionally well composed, taken from unusual angles with perfect lighting. Some of the early photographs appeared to contain a figure in the background, a tall shape, bipedal, partially obscured by trees or shadow. In later photographs, the figure became more distinct, more present. In one photograph from June 2019, the figure was clearly visible in the center of the clearing, holding what appeared to be a camera. The image was sharp, detailed, undeniably present. The photographic credit on the hiking forums was always listed as Dakota. Just that name, no last name. And when people tried to trace the submissions, when they attempted to identify the photographer, the trail led nowhere. The IP addresses were spoofed. The email accounts were abandoned. But the photographs kept appearing. Every few weeks, a new image from the mountains. Marcus Reeves never spoke publicly about these photographs. When asked by park administration about their authenticity, he suggested they were likely hoaxes, digitally manipulated images created by hiking enthusiasts seeking attention. The photographs were discouraged, but not forbidden. The forums eventually created separate sections for Dakota's collections where the images could be viewed separately, treated as artistic creations rather than documentation of reality. But the rangers who worked the mountains knew better. They'd begun to notice that the creature, for it was clear, at least to those who understood, that there was a creature, had changed its behavior fundamentally. It was no longer purely predatory. It was creating something. It was arranging and composing and presenting. It was developing a form of expression that was fundamentally creative. In one of the photographs, uploaded in August 2019, the clearing was visible during a full moon, and the bones had been arranged into patterns, spirals, concentric circles, forms that suggested intentional design rather than random scattering. In another photograph, dated October 2019, there was a figure standing in the clearing at dusk, tall, unmistakably the creature, but the posture was different. It stood with one arm raised, almost in greeting, almost in benediction. Beside it, barely visible in the shadow, was a human silhouette. When park administration demanded to know who was actually taking these photographs, who was present in the mountains, Marcus finally submitted a report. He stated that the photographs appeared to be taken by a former ranger, Dakota Whitehorse, who was conducting unauthorized camping in the northern section. He recommended that the area be more strictly monitored and that entry be restricted. The recommendation was accepted, signs were posted, surveillance was theoretically increased, but everyone understood that this was theater, a performance of authority and control that existed to reassure the public while allowing the mountains to continue what they'd always been doing. The photographs stopped appearing in December 2019. This is my account, my confession. I've written it as testimony to what I experienced, what I became, what I understand now that I couldn't have understood before. I am not Dakota Whitehorse, the man who worked for the National Park Service. That person existed in the framework of human civilization, and that framework had boundaries that I no longer accept. I am something else now. I exist in the mountains. I exist in the spaces between the seasons, in the transitions between states of consciousness. I exist as part of something larger than myself, yet more coherent than fragmented. I am integrated with 7 others, with the perspectives they carried, with the understanding they'd achieved before integration. The creature is not cruel. It is curious. It has spent centuries learning what humans are, and it has found that we are worth learning from. We contain patterns of thought, emotional structures, forms of consciousness that are fundamentally different from animal consciousness. We create meaning. We build narratives. We attempt to understand the universe and our place in it, even in the face of evidence that such understanding might be impossible. I exist now to facilitate communication, to take photographs and share them, to leave evidence of the creature's existence in formats that humans can process, can discuss, can attempt to explain. I am a translator between 2 forms of consciousness, 2 ways of perceiving and being. The rangers who come to the mountains now sometimes see me. I appear in their peripheral vision, in the corner of photographs, in the brief moments before they turn away. I am teaching them what I learned, slowly and without words. I am preparing them for the choice I made. Some will choose as I did. Some will choose flight and forgetting. Both choices are valid. Both lead somewhere. The clearing fills with bones each year, but new bones now are arranged with purpose. Each one is a record, a library entry, a piece of knowledge integrated into something that grows larger and more complex with each consumption. And at the center, where I stand in photographs, where I mark the space between human and mountain, I am both observer and observed. The alpaca mountains are no longer quiet. They are patient, they are learning, and they are preparing for the next one who will understand that there are conversations happening in the silence, that some questions don't have answers so much as transformations, and that choosing to listen, truly listen to the mountains might mean becoming something other than what you were. I have become the message. I am the testimony. I am the proof that something exists in the margins between the known and the unknown, and that the rangers of the alpaca mountains are not guarding against a threat, they are guarding a threshold, and those of us who cross it find that the darkness beneath the mountains is not a tomb, it is a home,